Committee will come to order. This hearing is entitled The Administration's Auto Bailouts and the Delphi Pension Decisions. Who picked the winners and the losers? We have a distinguished panel before us today, but it is always the order of this subcommittee by reading the Oversight and Government Reform Committee's mission statement. The Oversight Committee mission statement. We exist to secure two fundamental principles. First, Americans have a right to know that the money Washington takes from them is well spent. And second, Americans deserve an efficient, effective government that works for them. Our duty on the Oversight and Government Reform Committee is to protect these rights. Our solemn responsibility is to hold government accountable to taxpayers, because taxpayers have a right to know what they get from their government. We will work tirelessly in partnership with citizen watchdogs to deliver the facts to the American people and bring genuine reform to the federal bureaucracy. And that is what this hearing is about, the auto bailout decision and the winners and the losers that resulted from this. We have a distinguished panel here today, and I'll begin by recognizing myself for 5 minutes. Today's hearing is about the transparency in government and fulfilling this committee's commitment to provide the American people with answers and accountability. When Congress passed the Troubled Asset Relief Program, known as TARP, or the bailouts, in October of 2008, at the height of the financial crisis, it was designed with a specific purpose: to take toxic assets off the books of large banks and financial institutions. While today's intention is not to relitigate TARP or the bailouts, it is important to discuss their consequences, and indeed there are consequences. When the government orchestrates a bailout, it is clear that there will be both winners and losers. While some of my colleagues will spend a great deal of time talking about bailout winners, it is unlikely that you'll hear them spend much time talking about the bailout losers. Although their losses were significant, we're not here to discuss bondholders who took a haircut in the auto bailout. We're here today to focus on non-unionized retirees at Delphi who watched part of their pensions disappear while some of their coworkers were made whole. Those coworkers whose pensions were left intact were members of the United Auto Workers Union, and they are clear winners of the auto bailouts. A recent study from one of today's witnesses, George Mason University law professor Todd Zywicki, calculated that United Auto Workers received approximately $26 billion from taxpayers via the auto bailouts that they would not have received had they been treated according to standard bankruptcy principles. Mr. Zywicki is a witness here today, and we look forward to hearing from him. When the Pension Benefit Guaranty Corporation terminated the pensions of all Delphi retirees, General Motors agreed to top up or make whole their obligations to unionized workers. At the same time, the non-unionized workers took significant cuts in their pensions. Despite the fact that GM's promise to the union could have been thrown out in bankruptcy, like so many of GM's other non-unionized commitments were, the union agreement was kept in place. That was a decision made by the government. The Special Inspector General for the Troubled Asset Relief Program has been seeking answers to questions about the irregularities of the Delphi pension decisions. Ms. Romero is a witness here today as the Special Inspector General for TARP. We're here today because for over a year, 3 of the key figures involved in the GM and Chrysler bailouts have refused to meet with the Special Inspector General. I'm grateful that they showed today, and we're very interested in hearing their testimony and their reasons for not meeting with the Special Inspector General. On May 9th, the Special Inspector General notified the committee that 3 former Obama administration officials before us today, Mr. Bloom, Mr. Feldman, and Mr. Wilson, had been uncooperative with the Special Inspector General's audit. These 3 individuals come from diverse backgrounds and possess different expertise, but together represent leading figures from President Obama's auto task force. All three of these individuals made pivotal decisions which are projected to cost taxpayers $23 billion and have left many Delphi retirees with drastically reduced pensions while preserving full pensions for Delphi's unionized retirees. These are the consequences of the bailouts. So with that, I would recognize the ranking member, Mr. Quigley of Illinois, for 5 minutes, and following that, I'll recognize Mr. Turner from Ohio for 5 minutes for an opening statement. And if the gentleman would like 5 additional minutes, we would be willing to grant that.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate that. I'm sure it won't be necessary in today's case. I want to thank the Chairman for holding this hearing. No one understands or appreciates the importance of transparency and strong oversight in government more than members of this committee. Congress created the Office of Special Inspector General for the Troubled Asset Relief Program, SIGTARP, and members of Congress asked SIGTARP to perform its Delphi audit. Unfortunately, SIGTARP's audit has been stalled because they have not been able to interview 3 of the witnesses here today, Ron Bloom, Matt Feldman, and Harry Wilson, who are all former members of the Administration's Audit Task Force. In preparation for this hearing, the Democratic staff spoke with all 3 individuals and discovered they are willing to be interviewed by SIGTARP. This is a positive development, and I am glad that SIGTARP will now be able to complete its audit. SIGTARP's audit should complement the thorough work GAO has already completed on the Delphi pension issue. GAO published its findings on Delphi pensions in December of 2011. The GAO concluded that, quote, Treasury deferred to GM's business judgment and that Treasury did not explicitly approve or disapprove of GM providing top-ups, end of quote. Those are conclusions supported by the evidence gathered by GAO. Today, I am looking forward to hearing an update from SIGTARP on the progress of its audit, and I will be eager to read its final report upon completion. But the most important conclusion that should be drawn from the Audit Task Force actions is that they help save more than 1 million American jobs. As President Obama recently said, I was betting on the American worker and I was betting on American industry. And 3 years later, the American auto industry is coming roaring back. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. 1 second. Okay. Thank you, and I yield back.
I thank the ranking member, and I do want to, in the ranking member's opening statement, he suggested what we received in an email at 5:46 yesterday from the minority staff, that you have a commitment from the 3 auto bailout task force members today that they will meet with SIGTARP and fulfill that request that's been long-standing with them. And I thank the ranking member for getting those commitments, and I thank the minority staff for getting those commitments, because it has been it's been well over a year in the works of SIGTARP trying to get Mr. Bloom, Mr. Feldman, and Mr. Wilson to submit themselves for depositions. And with that, I'd like to enter into the record the timeline of interview requests from SIGTARP beginning in May 5th of 2011 and going through May 16th of 2012, including an email we received last night at 9:40 p.m. from SIGTARP explaining that the 3 witnesses in question had no communications of any sort indicating that they will make themselves available for the requested interviews in conjunction with our audit. So I do appreciate, without objection, those 2 documents will be entered into the record. And again, this is bipartisan work, and I appreciate the willingness of Mr. Quigley, of you and minority staff and counsel to get those commitments. And so we're hopeful that transparency is served from that. And I know the gentleman has been very active on those issues of transparency in government. So thank you. With that, I'll recognize Mr. Turner of Ohio, who's been a leader on the subject matter of this hearing for 5 minutes for the purposes of an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would like to thank you and Chairman Issa and, of course, Chairman Jordan for the work that has been done on this issue and for holding this important hearing today. Today's hearing continues our efforts to uncover why the Treasury Department, the Auto Task Force, and the Pension Benefit Guaranty Corporation chose to terminate the hard-earned pensions of Delphi salary retirees in the course of its multi-billion-dollar taxpayer-funded bailout of General Motors. Contrary to what the Vice President said recently on one of his campaign stops, that these retirees are doing fine, they're not doing fine. Thousands of retirees lost their pensions, many of which are in my community in Dayton, Ohio, as a result of the administration's decisions during the auto bailout. Appearing on CNN this Sunday, the White House Chief of Staff, Jack Lew, proclaimed that this administration is the most transparent ever. Well, not on this issue, and we're going to find out why today. Understandably, I have serious concerns about how this administration, including the 3 members of the Auto Task Force we have before us, have continued to stonewall, provided silence on these issues, and repeated failures to disclose information that are critical to the issues that have affected almost 20,000 people across the country, and that was done with taxpayers' dollars. This is not a venture that was undertaken with your own money. It was undertaken with taxpayers' money, and the openness that this administration promised needs to be enforced. In part, we are here today because 3 former Auto Task Force members refused to meet with, speak to, or testify before the Special Inspector General for the TARP program. It is my hope that we will shed light on who within the administration made the decision to cut the hard-earned retirement benefits of these Delphi salary retirees, and that perhaps the administration's policy of denying access to this information, hiding behind backroom deals, stops. I want to thank Christy Romero and SIGTARP for being here today and for your honesty in your letter. You wrote us a letter that said that SIGTARP believes that the Auto Task Force played a role in the pension decision, and these individuals' failure to speak to SIGTARP on this issue poses a significant obstacle to SIGTARP's ability to complete this audit. And then you acknowledge that you didn't have an ability to subpoena these 3 gentlemen, to make them testify. You also acknowledge in your written testimony that you commenced this as a result of several members of Congress, including myself, asking you to undertake the audit to get questions answered about how this process went forward. Mr. Bloom, Mr. Feldman, Mr. Wilson, the happy train of silence and refusing to answer questions ends today. You have been summoned before Congress because of your refusal to answer SIGTARP's questions because they didn't have the ability to compel you. You're here today because you know we do. You didn't come here because you believed you wanted to share information with Congress. You were brought here because of your refusal to share the information that the American public is entitled to hear as a result of taxpayers' dollars that were used in the auto bailout of General Motors and thousands of people that lost their pensions. There's an accountability here. Now, you're going to take an oath when you testify today. This is not a political proceeding. This is a legal proceeding. You will be testifying. You will not be giving speeches. That's why you're sworn in. It's called testifying before Congress. And in that, I want you to rise to the level of understanding what that obligation is. It means that if you don't speak truthfully in front of us, that obviously you can be subject to perjury or disbarment or other types of consequences, because Congress takes people appearing before us seriously. Now, we're hearing, and we're looking forward to hearing from you, that you are now willing to cooperate. And I want you to also be aware that during that process of supposedly cooperating with SIGTARP, we have the ability to continue to enforce it. We have the ability to bring you in for depositions, under oath, bring you back before Congress again. If the information you provide is not complete and is not thorough, you will continue to have your happy train of silence met here with Congress, where the American people require answers because you served in a public position with public dollars and public obligations, and today we're going to have public questions. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I thank the gentleman from Ohio. Members will have 7 days to submit opening statements for the record, and we'll now recognize our panel of witnesses today. The Honorable Christy Romero is the Special Inspector General for the Troubled Asset Relief Program at the United States Department of Treasury. Mr. Ron Bloom, Mr. Matthew Feldman, and Mr. Harry Wilson are all former members of the Automotive Task Force at the United States Department of Treasury. Ms. Nikki Clowers is the Director of Financial Markets and Community Investment at the Government Accountability Office. Thank you for your service. Mr. Todd Zawicki is a Professor of Law at George Mason University School of Law and a Senior Scholar at the Mercatus Center. As you all well know, this committee swears in witnesses before their testimony, so if you all please rise and raise your right hands. You'll be sworn before your testimony. Raise your right hand. Do you solemnly swear or affirm that the testimony you're about to give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? Yes. Thank you. You may be seated. Let the record reflect that the witnesses answered in the affirmative. You all are well practiced at testifying before Congress. As you well know, we have the light system here. Green means, as we know from traffic schools, or if you have tickets, repeated traffic schools. Green means go. Yellow means, well, hurry up. And red means stop. You'll have 5 minutes to summarize your testimony in order to allow for discussion and questions afterwards. We will begin with Ms. Christy Romero for 5 minutes.
Chairman McHenry, Ranking Member Quigley, and members of the committee, I'm very honored to appear before you today and very much want to thank you for holding this hearing. SIG-TARP was created to protect the interest of those who funded TARP, and that's the American taxpayers. And an important part of SIG-TARP's mission is to bring transparency to the decisions that were made by the government in the wake of the financial crisis. By examining the past, we can take advantage of lessons learned so that we can better protect taxpayers in the future. In addition, taxpayers have an absolute right to know the decisions that went into how TARP dollars were spent. The government provided approximately $80 billion in TARP funds in the auto bailout, and SIG-TARP has brought transparency to decisions made by Treasury and the Auto Task Force in the auto bailout. We seek to bring greater transparency to GM's decisions to provide funds to top up the pensions of certain hourly workers who are at Delphi Corporation, who were formerly employed by GM and who were represented by one of 3 unions. We are conducting an audit review of Treasury's role in that decision and whether the Auto Task Force pressured GM to provide additional funding for those pensions. We have closely coordinated with GAO, who conducted similar but not duplicative reviews. We have experienced significant delay by the refusal to be interviewed by the 3 former Treasury officials who served on the auto team, Mr. Bloom, Mr. Wilson, and Mr. Feldman. The former co-head of the auto team, Mr. Ratner, only agreed to be interviewed this May. These individuals were heavily involved in the TARP assistance to GM and GM's restructuring and have knowledge about the pension issues. We first requested from Treasury interviews of these former Treasury officials in May 2011. Months later, Treasury told us that the individuals would not meet with SIG-TARP while other members of the auto team would. We contacted these individuals directly while reviewing documents and interviewing other witnesses. We asked Treasury to speak to these former Treasury officials about the importance of cooperating with SIG-TARP. When it became clear that the individuals would not agree to be interviewed, we informed this committee. The lack of cooperation by these former Treasury officials has significantly protracted SIG-TARP's review. We were forced to look elsewhere for the information. While we continued to request their cooperation, we reviewed more than 100,000 pages of documents, but those documents do not provide a complete picture. We often find in our audits a lack of detailed and complete documentation of decision-making related to TARP. Many discussions and decisions are made in meetings and telephone calls. Interviews of government officials are essential to gain a complete picture. Documents such as emails simply do not tell the whole story. We interviewed others who might have information. We interviewed 43 current and former officials from GM, Delphi, 3 unions, PBGC, the auto team, and DSRA, which represents certain Delphi salaried workers whose pensions GM did not top up. Information from these witnesses and documents led SIG-TARP to determine that Mr. Wilson, Mr. Feldman, and Mr. Bloom were the government officials who were involved in the Delphi pension decision and discussions. SIG-TARP does not have the ability to compel witness testimony. There is no valid reason for these former Treasury officials to refuse to be interviewed. Treasury suggested that SIG-TARP's interviews are unnecessary because GAO already determined Treasury's role and because Mr. Wilson and Mr. Feldman were deposed in GM and Delphi's bankruptcies. GAO did not conduct interviews of Treasury's role or whether there was any pressure by the auto team, instead deferring to SIG-TARP. Also, we've read the depositions and still find it necessary to conduct the interviews. The refusal by these former Treasury officials to speak to SIGTARP poses a significant obstacle to our ability to complete the audit and to taxpayers gaining a full understanding of the discussions and considerations in GM's decision. Our need to speak with them is significant, but that's balanced with the fact that there is no hardship for these individuals to come talk with us. Other important and very busy government officials have been interviewed by SIGTARP, including Secretary Geithner, former Secretary Paulson, Chairman Bernanke, and former Chairman Baer. Also, and this is very important, it sets a dangerous precedent if former Treasury officials who worked on TARP programs are allowed to evade SIGTARP's oversight and refuse to be interviewed. Such a precedent could potentially impact all of our ongoing and future audits. Most of the government officials who worked on TARP have since left government service. I want to thank the committee for always supporting SIGTARP, and I'm available to answer any questions that you have.
Thank you, Mr. Romero, and thank you for your service to our government. Mr. Bloom, recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman and members of the committee, good morning. While I am here today at your request in my capacity as a former Treasury official, I left the Treasury Department in February of 2011 and left government service in September of 2011. I am therefore not in a position to discuss events since February 2011 or anything concerning possible future actions. During the period of my government service, I testified regarding the Treasury's automotive investments in front of the Senate Banking Committee on June 10, 2009, the House Judiciary, Commercial and Administrative Law Subcommittee on July 21, 2009, the Congressional Oversight Panel on July 27, 2009 and February 25, 2010, and the House Subcommittee on Regulatory Affairs, Stimulus Oversight and Government Spending on June 22, 2011. In addition, I participated in numerous meetings and discussions and helped prepare and deliver written and oral responses to countless inquiries of SIGTARP, GAO, Congressional Oversight Panel, and individual elected officials and staff from both the House of Representatives and the Senate. I understand that the committee has taken an interest in issues regarding the pensions of certain former employees of the Delphi Corporation. As you may know, I was named as a defendant in a lawsuit in federal court regarding that issue. On September 2, 2011, I was dismissed from the case, as was Treasury and the President's Auto Task Force. When President Obama took office, the American automobile industry was on the verge of collapse. In the year prior, the industry lost over 400,000 jobs, and as 2008 came to a close, both GM and Chrysler were running out of cash and faced the imminent prospects of uncontrolled liquidations. The collapse of the U.S. auto industry posed a substantial risk to financial market stability and the economy as a whole. Therefore, the previous administration provided $24.8 billion to the auto industry. After studying the restructuring plans submitted by GM and Chrysler, President Obama decided that he would not commit any additional taxpayer resources to these companies without fundamental change and accountability. He rejected their initial plans and demanded that they develop more ambitious strategies to reduce costs and increase efficiencies. However, President Obama also recognized that failing to stand behind these companies would have far-reaching consequences. GM and Chrysler were supported by a vast network of auto suppliers, which employed 3 times as many workers and depended on the automaker's business to survive. An uncontrolled liquidation of a major automaker would have had a cascading effect throughout the supply chain, causing failures and job losses on a much larger scale. Because Ford and other auto companies depended on those same suppliers, the failure of the suppliers could have caused those auto companies to fail as well. Also at risk were the thousands of auto dealers across the country, as well as small businesses and communities with concentrations of auto workers. It was this interdependence that led some experts at the time to estimate that at least 1 million jobs could have been lost if GM and Chrysler went under. Widely respected economist Mark Zandi recently stated that 2.5 million jobs were at risk. These were grave risks at a time when our economy was losing 750,000 jobs per month. Credit markets were still not functioning properly. Bank lending had contracted substantially, and there was no chance of securing private lending on a scale sufficient to save GM and Chrysler. To avoid uncontrolled liquidations, the President decided to give GM and Chrysler a chance to show that they could take the tough and painful steps to become viable companies. Working with their stakeholders in the President's Auto Task Force, both GM and Chrysler underwent fair and open bankruptcies. This process required deep and painful sacrifices from all stakeholders, including workers, retirees, suppliers, dealers, creditors, and the countless communities that rely on a vibrant American auto industry. The steps that the President took avoided a catastrophic collapse of the entire auto industry and kept hundreds of thousands of Americans working. Today, the American automobile industry is mounting a comeback. In 2011, GM, Chrysler, and Ford increased their U.S. market share for the second year in a row. Exports of motor vehicles in 2011 increased by 21% over 2010. This increase in market share and exports has translated into more American jobs. Since 2009, the auto industry has added over 233,000 jobs, the fastest pace of job growth in the auto industry since 1997. In addition, since 2009, GM and Chrysler have announced investments totaling over $11.5 billion. In a better world, the choice to intervene in GM and Chrysler would not have had to be made. But amidst the worst economic crisis in a generation, the Administration's decisions avoided devastating liquidations and provided the American auto industry a new lease on life and a real chance to succeed. I am prepared to do my best to answer your questions.
Mr. Feldman, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman and members of the committee, I understand that I have been requested to appear today before you to discuss my role with the Treasury Department's auto team, which I joined in March of 2009 as Chief Legal Advisor and on which I served until August of 2009. The Treasury Department recruited me to join the auto team from my career as an attorney in private practice, where I specialize in reorganizing and restructuring large businesses, not unlike the American automobile manufacturers that were in significant financial distress at that time in 2009. I believe that the work of the auto team contributed to a successful effort to avert disastrous consequences to both the American automobile industry and the American economy as a whole. I am fiercely proud of my service, and I am prepared today to assist the committee in reaching a complete understanding of the auto team's work during what was a difficult time and an unprecedented challenge for all involved. Although it is wonderful to see the dramatic recovery of the automobile manufacturers and the thousands of American jobs that were saved as a result of our work, I am mindful that the restructurings that the auto team worked on required many Americans to make great personal sacrifices. As a result of the Delphi Corporation bankruptcy, for example, Delphi and the Pension Benefit Guaranty Corporation were forced to terminate Delphi's pension plans, which means that there are Delphi retirees who unfortunately will collect less than their full pension benefits. Delphi had underfunded its hourly pension plan and later its salaried pension plan well prior to filing for bankruptcy protection, a situation that ultimately threatened General Motors' future success as it exited from its own bankruptcy. Because General Motors viewed a well-motivated workforce at its largest supplier as critical to ensuring an uninterrupted supply chain, General Motors made the commercially reasonable and necessary decision to honor certain top-up agreements it entered into in 1999 with the United Auto Workers and certain other unions when Delphi was first spun off from General Motors. Sadly, many of Delphi's employees did not have top-up agreements with General Motors, and some of those employees will face a shortfall in their pension payments as the PBGC assumes responsibility for their plans. The auto team agreed that honoring the top-up agreements was a prudent business decision, and we believe that doing so would protect both General Motors and the American taxpayers' collective investment in the company. We supported General Motors' business decision, and I remain convinced today that it was the best course of action available at that time. While I am pleased that General Motors and other American automobile manufacturers have become successful, profitable contributors to our economy, I recognize that the restructuring process imposed painful but necessary sacrifices on many of Delphi's stakeholders. As a bankruptcy practitioner and a restructuring specialist, I have seen similar circumstances all too often. It is without a doubt one of the most difficult, disheartening aspects of my job, and I have only the deepest sympathy for everyone affected. Prior to my invitation to testify here today, I received a request from the Office of the Special Inspector for Troubled Asset Relief Program that I participate in an interview. I attempted to determine what further information SIGTARP believed it required to complete its audit because my memory concerning specific details was considerably better in July 2009 when I gave a lengthy deposition in connection with the Delphi Chapter 11 proceedings that covered many of the topics concerning my role on the auto team. It was my hope that the transcript of that deposition, along with the extensive documentary records SIGTARP has undoubtedly assembled, would be sufficient to meet SIGTARP's needs. After several requests, SIGTARP provided a list of six topics on which it desired further information, but it appears that SIG-TARP contacted the subcommittee before I had an opportunity to respond. In any event, I am here today prepared to answer any questions the subcommittee has concerning my role on the audit team, which I will do to the best of my ability.
Thank you. Mr. Wilson.
Chairman McHenry, Ranking Member Quigley, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to testify before you today. I'm here to report at your request on the government's efforts in 2009 to avoid a catastrophic collapse of the U.S. automotive industry, and specifically regarding its investments in General Motors. My testimony today is in my capacity as a former Treasury official, which I left in early August 2009, so that is the limit of my direct knowledge. First, some brief background on myself. I've spent the vast majority of my career in the private sector, working in some of the best financial firms in the country, with a focus on fixing troubled businesses. As the late 2008 financial crisis deepened and the Bush and then Obama administrations began to intervene through TARP, I felt it was critical that Treasury officials had the restructuring skills that I had in order to minimize the cost to taxpayers. So though I'm a lifelong Republican, due to my desire to serve my country, I joined the auto team in early March 2009 and focused primarily on General Motors. After General Motors exited bankruptcy, I wrapped up my work and left Treasury. I've continued my turnaround work both in the private sector and the public sector since then. For example, in 2010, I was a Republican nominee for New York State Comptroller. I ran on a platform of seeking to fix New York State's broken government, and though I lost in a very close race with nearly 2.1 million votes, I was the top Republican vote-getter in New York in 2010. Shortly after that, I founded my firm, the Mava Group, LLC, which is focused on fixing problem companies. Now let me turn to the auto rescue. In late 2008, early 2009, GM and Chrysler were on the verge of collapse due to years of mismanagement and the financial crisis. Unfortunately, the capital markets were in the middle of an unprecedented shutdown, obliterating any possibility of private financing. This lack of private financing and the substantial interdependency of the American automotive industry meant the following. One, that absent tens of billions of dollars, GM and Chrysler will liquidate. Two, their liquidation would have meant the failure of many of their suppliers. And three, the widespread failure of suppliers would have threatened Ford, which is why Ford never opposed our work. It is only because of this unique confluence of events, this once-in-a-lifetime storm that threatened to destroy an essential American industry, that I, a staunch fiscal conservative, reluctantly came to accept that the only alternative, the least bad option, was emergency financial support, the path initiated by the Bush administration. And the Obama administration's decision to pursue this work in a commercial manner, as they defined, meant that we would seek the best outcome with the minimum potential cost to the taxpayer. The results of that work speak for themselves. GM had its most profitable year ever in 2011. Even though auto sales have still not fully recovered to pre-crisis levels, it has grown market share and it now has a fortress balance sheet. Tragically, the human costs of these massive restructurings were significant, and that is the sad part of any restructuring. But absent the auto team's work, the human costs and the cost to the American taxpayer would have been far, far greater. While Treasury was closely involved in pressing GM management for the major changes needed to make the company profitable, we were very careful to never get involved in specific decisions on plant closures, dealer closures, or the like. We would agree with GM on the broad strokes, which was to create a world-class auto business and the key components of that, and they would make the detailed decisions that needed to be made to implement those broad strokes. And this approach applied to the same sad story of Delphi. When Delphi came to the auto team's attention, Delphi was bleeding approximately $150 million in cash per month. GM was supporting Delphi because Delphi was the sole supplier for certain critical GM parts. So a Delphi liquidation would have shut down all of General Motors. This was an unsustainable proposition, both for GM and for the American taxpayer. To resolve Delphi's long bankruptcy, GM management agreed to various measures, including providing capital and honoring the top-up agreements GM had made in 1999. Other commitments, including pensions for salaried employees or other unionized employees not covered by top-up agreements, were not accorded additional consideration. Consistent with the rest of our work, Treasury provided general input, but not specific decisions in these matters, as was recognized in the GAO finding in December 2011. So in closing, the restructuring world is a difficult one, filled with painful choices to minimize the human and financial costs while maximizing the probability of a company's long-term success. The human costs of the GM rescue were deep, significant, and tragic, and those who have suffered loss of any kind have my deepest sympathies. But as great as those costs were, they paled in comparison to the costs of inaction. As a fiscal conservative, I wish our work had not been necessary. As an American citizen, I wish that more companies operated with better management so that these tragic situations would not happen as frequently as they do. But amidst the worst financial crisis in the past 75 years, the actions of the Bush and Obama administrations avoided devastating liquidations and provided the American auto industry a second chance. And then one last point on testifying. I would disagree with the characterization of my particular willingness to testify, because I believe, as SIGTARP now knows, I've committed to both the majority staff last Thursday, the minority staff on Sunday, and through Treasury to SIGTARP officials themselves to testify. I'd be happy to do so. With that, I'll look forward to your questions.
We certainly appreciate that willingness that's been just over a year in the making, but we're grateful for it nonetheless, and as well as the other two members of the task force, even if it's at the 11th hour. And we're grateful, as I said, for the ranking member and his good work, and the minority staff good work on securing those commitments the day before this important hearing. We're simply just trying, and thank you for submitting that for the record. That's going to be one of my questions, if we could submit for the record, whether or not the three members of the task force represented today will submit themselves for that interview with SIGTARP. The outline that I have of extensive requests from SIGTARP to you three gentlemen, Mr. Bloom, Mr. Feldman, and Mr. Wilson, is extensive. And so pardon me for not relieving you of the burden of testifying before Congress when we get that commitment at 5:46 the day before a 10 a.m. hearing. But I think we're going to continue with this, and expect some questions on that, as I'm sure you do. Mr. Wilson, Mr. Feldman, thank you for your willingness to testify on the particular issue of this hearing. And Mr. Bloom will direct some questions to you to see if you'll be willing to submit some testimony for that. With that, Ms. Clowers from the Government Accountability Office, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman McHenry, Ranking Member Quigley, and members of the subcommittee. I appreciate you having me here today to speak about the termination of Delphi's pension plans. In my comments today, I will discuss two issues. First, the key events leading to the termination of Delphi's pension plans, and two, the role of the Department of Treasury in those events. My comments are based on our recent reports on these issues. First, the termination of Delphi's pension plans and the provision of retirement benefit supplements, also called top-ups, to some Delphi employees but not others, culminated from a complex series of events involving Delphi, GM, various unions, Treasury, PBGC, that stretched back to 1999. In that year, GM spun off Delphi as an independent company. At that time, GM agreed to provide top-ups to collectively bargained hourly employees, meaning that if something went wrong with these pension plans for these employees after Delphi became a separate company, GM would ensure these employees received their promised benefits. No such agreement was negotiated for salaried employees. When these agreements were negotiated, Delphi's pension plan for the hourly workers was not fully funded. In contrast, the plan for the salaried workers was fully funded. Delphi filed for bankruptcy in 2005, and as part of its initial reorganization plan made public in 2007, the company planned to maintain its pension plans. But by this time, both the salaried and union pension plans were underfunded. As part of Delphi's exit from bankruptcy, GM agreed to take on some liabilities from Delphi's hourly pension plan in 2 phases. However, by the time GM declared bankruptcy in June 2009, it had only taken on the first phase of the plan's liabilities. GM did agree with the UAW, however, as part of its restructuring, that GM would honor the previously negotiated top-ups. Salaried Delphi employees and Delphi employees who belonged to other unions were not included in this agreement. Employees of these other unions, along with Delphi's salaried employees, protested this outcome in bankruptcy court. To maintain its supply chain, GM agreed to top up the pensions of 2 other unions as their consent was needed to resolve Delphi's bankruptcy. However, they did not agree to do so for the salaried workers, and this is where the situation stands today. I'd now like to discuss Treasury's role in these events. Treasury's role stemmed from its position as the primary lender to GM in its bankruptcy. As the primary lender, GM played a significant role in helping GM resolve the Delphi bankruptcy in terms of GM's interest. However, with regard to GM decisions about Delphi pension plans, court filings and statement from GM and Treasury officials suggest that Treasury deferred to GM's business judgment. Nevertheless, according to the records and Treasury officials, Treasury agreed with GM's assessment that the company could not afford the potential cost of sponsoring the Delphi hourly plan itself upon emerging from bankruptcy. Treasury also agreed with GM's rationale not to assume the Delphi salary plan, since that plan had been fully funded when GM transferred it to Delphi in 1999. As for the top-ups, Treasury officials said that while Treasury did not explicitly approve or disapprove of GM's agreement to honor previously negotiated top-up agreements with some unions, it agreed with GM's conclusion that it had solid commercial reasons to enter into such agreement. In particular, Treasury stated that its aim was to ensure that new GM would only assume the liabilities of old GM that were commercially necessary, and that due to new GM's continued dependency on the UAW workforce and the workforce of other unions, Treasury officials felt GM had solid commercial reasons to agree to the top-ups for these retirees. Also, Treasury stated that GM was never obligated to provide top-ups to the salaried or other retirees. In conclusion, Mr. Chairman, when companies go bankrupt and leave their plans with large unfunded liabilities, some participants will not get their full benefits promised to them by their employer. This, unfortunately, is not unusual. What makes this case more unusual is the series of events that unfolded over the last decade that lead us here today, and the number of players, including Delphi, PBGC, the unions, GM, and Treasury, and the roles they played. Mr. Chairman, Mr. Ranking Member, and members of the subcommittee, this completes my prepared statement. I would be happy to answer any questions that you may have at the appropriate time. My colleague, Charles Jessic, is also available to answer any specific questions regarding PBGC.
Thank you, and thank you for your testimony. Professor Zawicki, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Chairman McHenry, Ranking Member Quigley, and members of the subcommittee. It is my pleasure to testify today on matters related to the Obama administration's Automotive Task Force and the refusal of former Automotive Task Force members to cooperate in efforts to understand the task force's controversial decision to top up Delphi Corporation's pension plan for Delphi employees who are members of the United Auto Workers Labor Union. General Motors' decision to guarantee the obligations of a completely separate company, Delphi, was completely unjustified under current established principles of bankruptcy law, and it increased the cost of the taxpayer bailout of the automotive industry by more than $1 billion with no reciprocal benefit to General Motors. I commend this committee for seeking answers to this unexplained behavior by the Automotive Task Force and SIGTARP Christy Romero for insisting on answers to these questions. Altogether, the government pumped $80 billion of TARP funds into the bailouts of General Motors and Chrysler and related entities with, as Chairman McHenry suggested, not a shred of statutory basis for allocating funds in that manner. According to the United States Department of the Treasury, it is estimated that at current share prices, the loss to the American taxpayers will be about $23 billion from this investment in the automotive bailouts. Now, it would be one thing if to lose billions of dollars if it was necessary to facilitate the bankruptcy reorganization of these companies. But according to a recent paper by James Shirk and me, the entire loss to the taxpayers from the automotive bailouts is attributable to the unjustified preferential treatment of the UAW in bankruptcy, to the tune of $26.5 billion. To give you a sense of the size of those losses, that is larger than NASA's annual budget, that is larger than the entire foreign aid budget, and that is larger than the annual budget of the state of Missouri. It would be much more accurate to refer to this as a UAW bailout rather than a automotive bailout. We've heard a lot of talk about shared sacrifice today, but I think Stephen Ratner, the Obama administration's former car czar, said it best when he said, "We should have asked the UAW to do more. We did not ask any UAW member to take a cut in their pay." James Shirk and I document 3 different ways in which the UAW was given preferential treatment here that resulted in this massive loss to the taxpayers. First, the UAW VBUs were given far better treatment as unsecured creditors than any other unsecured creditors in either the General Motors or Chrysler bankruptcy cases. Second, UAW employees were given preferential treatment as employees. Usually, in bankruptcy cases, when confronted with above-market uncompetitive wage scale, bankruptcy is used to reduce them to competitive levels. That's going on right now, as we see in the airline bankruptcies, for instance, in which bankruptcy has been used to bring airline bankruptcy wage scales into competitive rates. In General Motors, the UAW did make wage concessions, but on behalf of future hires, not on behalf of any current employees, as Stephen Ratner admitted. And very few other concessions were made. As a result, the wages for General Motors in particular still remain above that of any foreign transplants and in any other states. Third brings us to the issue that we are here today. The $1 billion that was given by General Motors to top up the pensions of certain Delphi employees, the United Auto Workers, the IUE, and the USWA union members, but not other hourly employees or salaried workers. How can this be? Delphi was spun off in 1999, a full 10 years before the General Motors bankruptcy. They were a completely separate company. There was no continuing legal obligation for General Motors to pay for the retirement of the employees of a completely separate company. Instead, all we've heard, as far as I can tell, is a far-fetched rationalization that we needed to squander $1 billion for some theoretical fear related to this. It's hard to see any explanation other than political clout. What I would like to know is whether any rational investor would spend $1 billion of their own money to pay for the retirement of employees of a completely separate company, or whether they would be only willing to do it with our money, the money of the taxpayers. And perhaps it was necessary to have a targeted intervention in order to deal with the frozen credit markets at the time. That could be. Firms like this reorganize all the time, and I take any claims like that with a grain of salt. But by and large, this is a smokescreen for what we're talking about today. The question is today whether or not it was worth throwing away $26.5 billion worth of taxpayer dollars purely to preserve the benefits and the wages and everything else of the UAW. Was it worth it to go through bankruptcy and go through a process in which the Indiana teachers and police fighters lost some of their secured bonds in order to enrich the UAW? I look forward to questions.
Thank you, and thank you for your testimony. We have two current federal folks that are in federal service on this panel. I want to thank you for your current service to our government and to our people. I want to thank the three previous members of that were in government service for your service to our government and to our people. Public service should be just that. Now, there are also consequences for the decisions we make given the public trust, and that is in conjunction with that thought. That is what this hearing is about. I ask unanimous consent that our colleague from Ohio, Mr. Johnson, be allowed to participate in today's hearing. Without objection, that is ordered. I'll recognize myself for 5 minutes. For more than a year, SIGTARP has been trying to secure interviews to complete their work on this subject matter of the Delphi pension decisions. And I want to ask Mr. Bloom, why were you not willing to cooperate?
I was very involved in personal matters at the time. I'd spent a long time in government service, and I didn't believe I had anything that I could usefully contribute. But as I've said, if it's important to the committee, I'm prepared to sit with them now.
Mr. Feldman, same question. Why did you not? Why were you simply not willing to cooperate?
In 2009, when I was deposed with respect to these issues, I had felt at that time that I had answered and given all the information that I had available to me. I also, frankly, have left public life and have an active and busy private life, and my response to SIGTARP was, I think you have everything I can give you. Having said that, if an interview would be helpful, as I've said to the staffers, I'm prepared to cooperate.
Yeah, sure. Well, Mr. Feldman, to that matter, your attorney, Mr. Shatter, was contacted. SIGTARP was actually in New York and was willing to meet with you in August to September of last year, and you wouldn't participate. Mr. Wilson, same question. Why were you not willing to cooperate?
Sure. Mr. Chairman, I'll give you the same answer I gave to Treasury the time they approached me about it, which was I gave a lengthy deposition. I think I sat for 10 or 12 hours of testimony in the summer of 2009 related to the GM bankruptcy, testified on anything under the sun, as you can imagine, in that long period of time. I had the experience of being interviewed for Mr. Ratner's book on these activities in early or the summer of 2010. And frankly, I knew then that I could barely recall a lot of the facts from a year before. And now this was a year later, 2 years after the fact, and I said to Treasury, I don't remember a lot of what we went through. I could refresh my memory. It would take me probably a couple days of reading through public documents to do that, and I'm extremely busy, and I don't know how much I can add. And that was the exact response I gave to Treasury.
Gotcha. You're busy. I hear you. Not too busy to meet with Mr. Radner about this, but I'll be happy to yield to my colleague.
Thank you. Gentlemen, I respect your service, but let me just say this. The percentage of the American public that thinks that we do the right thing or will do the right thing is in single digits. The real cost of the problems that we faced here in my community of the public's perception of us and the public's perception of corruption is the loss of the ability to lead. The President characterized it as a deficit of trust. Now, I'm not suggesting for a second that you all did anything wrong, but you have to appreciate this lost year for whatever the personal reasons, or whether you're in public service or not, really doesn't matter. It is the perception of how things are done. It is the ability to have transparency to appreciate how you made the decisions. And if your answer is, with all due respect, where I don't remember, I get that. Or you just give the best answers you possibly can. But when you put things off in this manner, you don't help us, and you don't help the decisions you made. Frankly, I think we made the right decision. We're going to discuss that later about the bailout, because I thought the industry mattered. But I think the Chairman is correct. This was a mistake, and I appreciate your willingness to testify now, testify here, and to cooperate and to be interviewed by SIGTARP. But it's hard to add anything to what Ms. Romero said, except for the fact that it isn't that you have done anything wrong. It's that the American public has a right to know how those decisions were made when so much money was being spent, even if they agree with the decisions. So I mean no disrespect. I just wanted to add, to an extent, compliment what the Chairman was trying to say.
I thank the ranking member, and so the question I'll have, Mr. Bloom, is are you willing to submit yourself to an interview with SIGTARP within the next, let's say, 2 months?
Yes.
Mr. Feldman?
Yes.
Mr. Wilson?
Yes, I offered up for this afternoon. I haven't gotten a response yet, but I'd be happy to do that.
Excellent. Well, Ms. Romero, next time you don't have people willing to sit down with you for an interview, let me know. We'll be happy to have a hearing.
I can't say how grateful I am to the committee, to the chairman, to ranking member of the full committee, Cummings, to ranking member Quigley. This is all we wanted. All we wanted. We're also not reached any conclusions in our audit. How can we reach a conclusion? I mean, I can't characterize the role of these gentlemen played without giving them an opportunity to speak to that role. And this is all we've wanted, and I'm grateful, very grateful for that. It also goes beyond just these 3 witnesses in this audit, as I talked about in my opening statement. It'll be a very, very dangerous precedent if former Treasury officials or other government officials who worked on TARP matters and then leave refuse to be interviewed by SIGTARP, and that goes on and is allowed. So thank you very much.
Thank you. I thank you for your willingness to submit yourself for this. Mr. Ratner, who testified about this matter, the interview took approximately 2 hours with SIGTARP. I know you have busy lives, and I also know that this was a very important matter in your life, in both your public service and now in your private sector experience. This is something major for our nation, and I think we need to have an accurate portrayal of what actually happened and why you made the decisions that you made. Books have been written about this. There are going to be generations that talk about this excessive amount of government intervention, whether justified or unjustified, in the results of those bailouts. And I also will submit for the record that currently the GM stock price today is under $21. At the IPO, it was $33 for the government to break even, for the taxpayer to break even. That number had to be $53. So with that, we've had $16 billion in direct losses to the taxpayer based on the bailout of just GM. Now, I just want to submit that for the record. I do have other questions, but in the interest of other members' time, we'll now recognize Mr. Mr. Quigley for 5 minutes, after which we'll recognize Mr. Ross for 5 minutes. Mr. Quigley.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield to the ranking member of the full committee, Mr. Cummings.
Thank you very much. And Mr. Chairman, I want to associate myself with your words and those of Mr. Quigley and Ms. Romero with regard to the necessity and the importance of witnesses cooperating in these investigations. And I want to thank the witnesses for being here and for their service to the country. The former members of the Auto Task Force were part of the Obama administration's successful rescue of the American automotive industry. In December 2008, an analysis by the Economic Policy Institute projected that the bankruptcy of U.S. automakers and the collapse of the domestic auto assembly industry could eliminate up to 3.3 million U.S. jobs within the next year, and that's a quote. The collapse of General Motors alone would lead to an estimated loss of 900,000 jobs. That calamity was averted by the actions of you, our former members of the government, and on the Obama's administration's Auto Task Force. And you deserve our thanks, and we do appreciate what you have done. Today's hearing is not focused on these successes, but on why these three individuals have not yet been interviewed by the Special Inspector General for the Troubled Asset Relief Program, which is conducting a review of the Auto Task Force's work. And I'm very pleased to know that you are willing to submit yourself to being interviewed. I recognize that that you all are private citizens now and are under no obligation to speak with the Inspector General, but we support the Inspector General's office and want them to complete their work. As I understood it, this was the principal reason we were holding today's hearing. However, in preparing for the hearing, my staff contacted each of these three former officials, and all three of them said what they said today, that they are now willing to be interviewed. The Chairman has apparently decided to go forward with today's hearing, and that's his right. But as a result, we do not have the benefit of the Inspector General's final report, which I anxiously look forward to. I think this could have been handled with a few phone calls rather than a hearing, but that's not my call to make. Mr. Chairman, if you're going to proceed, and I know you are, I ask that you do so on an even-handed basis. There's another issue almost exactly like this one, in which an Inspector General has conducted a review, has sought to interview a former official, and has been refused. Unlike the present case, however, there is substantial evidence of serious abuses as well as unethical and potentially illegal conduct in that case. On 2 occasions, I've written to Chairman Issa about findings by the Inspector General of the National Labor Relations Board that a former board member, Mr. Peter Schramber, was regularly receiving deliberative, pre-decisional, and inside information from another board member, Mr. Peter Flynn. The Inspector General warned that Mr. Schramber had received copies of draft board decisions and other deliberative information on pending board actions. Yet the Inspector General was never able to conduct an interview of Mr. Schramber, who was a former employee. It seems to me that the only difference with that case is that it involved a Republican. Mr. Schramber served as a senior advisor and co-chair of the Labor Policy Advisory Group to presidential candidate Mitt Romney when he was engaged in these activities. As I stated from the outset, I strongly support our Inspectors General, and I believe our committee should help them when they cannot obtain access to information. So, Mr. Chairman, I know how diligent you are, and I would like to ask you now, will you support my request for a hearing with Mr. Schramber to obtain his testimony? Will you join me in requesting that the committee call him before us, like you called these three gentlemen before us today? And will you commit to conducting the operations of this committee on an even-handed basis?
Well, Mr. Cummings, I want to thank the ranking member. At the beginning of this hearing, I went through a significant amount of this timeline. I will be happy to look at the letter that you've presented this morning. I recognize that I was not on that exchange. I'm not familiar with the subject matter you're bringing up, but I trust the gentleman has a deep and abiding interest in government transparency. He's been diligent and a tough but fair ranking member in my dealings with the gentleman, having served on his subcommittee in my first term in Congress. And I thank you for bringing this subject matter up, and I'll be happy to look at this issue.
Just may I have another 20 seconds, please? And so I just ask unanimous consent that my two previous letters on this topic be entered into the record. We have been asking
without objection.
Well, since March, Mr. Chairman, and I see no difference between these cases, other than that the gentlemen here today have all agreed to be interviewed by the Inspector General, Mr. Schomburg, and Mr. Schomburg has not. I want to thank you for your patience, and thank you.
I thank the ranking member for bringing that subject matter up. Ms. Romero, to that end, have you contacted the committee about this subject matter and this witness?
As regards to these three
witnesses?
witnesses?
It's a different IG. I'm sorry.
Oh, okay.
I'm sorry. I was just informed of that. Yes. Well, thank you, Mr. Cummings, and I certainly, we will follow up with you on that. You have my commitment on that. And with that, we will now proceed to Mr. Ross of Florida for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's you to be commended for holding this hearing. You know, as a practicing lawyer, I find that justice doesn't always move at the rate we would like it to move, and the collection of facts is absolutely necessary for the rule of law to be applied and justice to prevail. While we're here on the 11th hour and now getting cooperation from the witnesses, I'm grateful for their cooperation. But Mr. Feldman, when you say that it should have been done back in July of 2009 when your deposition was taken and you had a better recollection of the events, I also think back to the witnesses that I would have in my cases, and am grateful for discovery depositions because it allows for a witness to recollect their thoughts and remember their testimony. So, again, I'm grateful for you all to agree now, but let me go into some questions here. Mr. Bloom, you indicated in your opening that the bankruptcy proceeding was fair and open. My question to you is was it any different than any other normal bankruptcy proceeding? I mean, was this not one of the most expedited bankruptcy proceedings in the history of the U.S.?
In my experience, it was faster than average, but there are other 363 sales.
Are you familiar with any other bankruptcies that were expedited in such a summary fashion?
Well, the sale of the parts of Lehman Brothers to Barclays in the Lehman bankruptcy, that portion of it, which was a 363 sale, which is what this was actually done more quickly.
And Mr. Feldman, are you familiar with, in your experience, of any company independent through a bankruptcy proceeding giving $1 billion to another company, as was done in this particular situation?
Certainly, they honored a contract, and they made the decision to honor the contract based on their business judgment, and I frankly think you see that in all the time in many, many bankruptcies.
Mr. Zawicki, how do you respond to that?
Well, first, I would say I've never seen a bankruptcy like this at all. I've taught bankruptcy for 15 years. I practiced bankruptcy. I've never seen a bankruptcy case in which secured creditors receive 29 cents on the dollar and unsecured creditors receive 44 cents on the dollar, which is what happened here. And again, some of those secured creditors were other retirees, the Indiana policemen and teachers' retirement unions. I've never seen under the guise of a 363 sale, what really amounted to what is effectively a sub rosa plan, which is not just selling the company, but dictating how the assets are going to be distributed. What we also saw in this case was an auction that was anything but a fair auction of the assets. There was strings attached to it that basically required that anybody who bought.
Was UAW that effective?
Well, and that was also that any other company, anybody else who wanted to bid on the company was required to give preferential treatment to the UAW in the same sort of way that the government did with respect to honoring the VBAs. once the company went into bankruptcy, of course, we saw a lot of other shenanigans. But I've never seen any bankruptcy case that resembled this in terms of the impact on the rule of law, the way in which it scrambled around priorities, and the speed at which they essentially sold the company and distributed the assets.
Thank you. Mr. Bloom, what role did the Auto Task Force or other administration officials play in the negotiations between GM and the UAW in this bankruptcy?
I think the role we played in that generally was the same role we played with most of the issues, which is to say that General Motors, we deferred to General Motors in terms of their business judgment about how to handle a particular matter, and I think the UAW negotiation would fall into that category. But we reviewed that decision to see if we agreed that it was commercially reasonable.
And did the UAW have a great deal of leverage in these negotiations?
I think it would be fair to say they had a degree of leverage. I wouldn't describe it.
Do you think they would have derailed the entire deal over the salaries of a few?
I can't speculate as to what they might have
Feldman,
done. I think our judgment at the time was that the judgments that GM made were reasonable.
Mr. Feldman, your opinion? The UAW exerted a great deal of leverage in this negotiation?
I think everybody in the case who had leverage exerted that leverage. The UAW was really no different than any other participant.
Do you think they would have derailed the negotiations over?
I truly don't know. General Motors.
But you would have to have speculated. I mean, this is your forte.
I don't think speculating is my forte. My forte is how to move companies through Chapter 11, including these two companies, Chrysler and General Motors.
And never on speculation?
I try not to.
Thank you. With regard to the payback, now, let's say that under the Bush administration we give GM $10. Under the Obama administration we give $20 to GM. GM pays back $20. In this particular example, it hasn't all been paid back. Was that something that was never intended to come to fruition, or was it just that we wanted to make sure that we pay back what was given under the Obama administration? Mr. Feldman, I'll go to you for that.
I don't think that was the intention. The intention was to get paid back. Unfortunately, in the case of General Motors, the stock price has not performed as I think people hoped it would. But one of the reasons that General Motors was delevered to the extent it was delevered was to hopefully help the stock price.
I see my time's expired, so I'll yield back. Thank you.
I thank my colleague. We'll now recognize Ms. Spear from California for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. And I want to thank Mr. Feldman, Mr. Wilson, and Mr. Bloom for being here as private citizens today and for recognizing that there is a responsibility as private citizens to support one's country. Professor, you referenced shenanigans, which I thought was an interesting term, because I could think of a lot of shenanigans that went on with Wall Street, and particularly Goldman Sachs, with Abacus among many other. Would you call those shenanigans?
I don't know those in detail, but I certainly would be, if I looked at it, I'd be willing to call them shenanigans, and a lot of them, it would be possible, but I have not looked at those as much detail as I have with respect to these auto bankruptcies.
Well, with Goldman Sachs, they actually created a product for a specific individual who wanted to short them and then sold those products as if they were good, outstanding products. Those, to me, are that kind of conduct is shenanigans. I think a company going bankrupt is not necessarily shenanigans, or trying to keep it alive is not necessarily shenanigans. Let me ask you, Mr. Wilson, as you noted in your testimony, you are a lifelong Republican, and proud of it, no doubt. And you were the Republican, Conservative, and Independent Party nominee for New York State's Comptroller. Is that true?
Yes.
The work you did to rescue the U.S. auto industry was about doing what was best for the country, was it not?
Yes.
At any time, did you detect that persons on your team were pursuing a political agenda?
No.
Were you attempting to push a particular political agenda?
Only to save as much taxpayer money as possible.
Oh, what a novel idea, to save taxpayer money. Is that what you were engaged in doing?
Yes.
Okay. Is it true that you were working to stave off a potential collapse of a very large and interdependent U.S. automotive industry, and that you were deferring to the company's business judgment regarding many of these detailed decisions?
Yes.
So as you look back at your time, would you say that you regret having done anything as a member of that task force?
I wouldn't say, I mean, we could always do a better job. You always have second thoughts and wish you did better than anything you do in life. But certainly I feel that we did the best we could given the circumstances and the timing, and I think it was the right thing for the country.
So are you proud with what happened?
Yes.
How about you, Mr. Feldman?
I think I said in my opening remarks that I remain fiercely proud. I think what we did was, with a lot of help from a lot of other people in the government and at the companies, pretty spectacular for these companies, frankly.
Mr. Bloom?
Yeah, I would just echo my former colleague's comments, and I would emphasize Mr. Feldman's point. There were a lot of people who worked extremely hard on this matter, but I think collectively a very good result was achieved compared to the alternative.
Now, each of you is going to now provide a deposition to SIGTARP on your activities. And we also have a GAO report that has been completed that suggests that there was nothing underhanded. Have you read the GAO report? Do you have any comments on that GAO report? Any of you?
I've read the GAO report. I suspect my colleagues have as well. I didn't take issue with anything in the GAO report. I thought it was overall a very good job.
Anyone else have any comments? Mr. Bloom?
I wouldn't disagree.
All right. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. I want to thank the Chairman for yielding the gavel to me during this period of asking questions. And I want to thank the Ranking Member, Mr. Quigley. This is a bipartisan issue. If you notice, the topic of this hearing is not the auto bailout, the questions of whether or not it should have been done or shouldn't have been done. The topic is the Delphi pensions, those who did not receive the top-up or their pensions being held, in fact, had their pensions reduced, and the involvement of the Auto Task Force and these three gentlemen and their refusal to participate in that. The GAO report did not have information for determining their role or their responsibilities. And Mr. Bloom, you've said that you've testified a number of times, but as you acknowledged in your own testimony, you did not testify concerning this topic because you claimed that there was ongoing litigation that would prevent you to stand in front of Congress and tell the truth. Mr. Feldman, do you have a medical condition that affects your memory?
I do not.
Great, thank you. Because in your testimony, you've foreshadowed that you might claim that you don't remember this stuff. When you go before SIGTARP or when the other questions are asked for you in this committee, and I would want to invite you to have a refreshed memory because of two things. One, when we pull up your law firm's advertisement of what you do, not only do they recognize that you have a practice that's complex litigation, assuming that clearly you recall it. But the very first thing it tells is that in March 2009 you were recruited to serve as the chief legal advisor for the strategy to restructure and recapitalize General Motors Corporation. It's the first item. So if your clients can avail themselves of the knowledge you had, we want to also. Mr. Bloom, you testified before this hearing on this committee on the Regulatory Affairs Subcommittee on June 22nd, 2011. At that hearing, I handed you 3 pages of questions. My staffer, Andy, who's going to hand them to you again, handed them to you at that hearing. Do you recall receiving these questions?
Yes.
Okay. I ask you if you would answer those questions, and let me refresh your memory as to what you said. Here's the video of you at that hearing.
Gentlemen, I presented both of you with lists of questions. Mr. Bloom, you received 25. Mr. Snowbarger, you received 30. I'm going to ask for your commitment that you review those questions and that you, to the best of your ability, provide me with answers. Do I have that commitment?
I will. Absolutely.
Thank you. Mr. Bloom, your answer to me on June 22nd, 2011 was absolutely. I have not received one answer from you. Why haven't you answered me?
Subsequent to the time before I had a chance to answer, I left government service.
So your answer changed because you left government service?
I did not feel it was appropriate that I continue to involve myself in this matter after I left government service.
Clearly this committee views that otherwise, as do the taxpayers. You had great responsibility, as also your current firm indicates and advertised you as the senior advisor at the U.S. Department of Treasury, where he helped lead the restructuring of General Motors. I mean, it's your accountability to the taxpayers. Will you commit, as you did in that hearing, to answer these questions now?
I'm here today, and if there are questions I can answer, I will do it.
Will you commit in writing to answer these questions as you did under oath in that hearing on June 22nd?
I will answer the questions I can answer today.
So we'll just keep you here, and I'll just orally ask you the questions with the chairman's approval then. Mr. Feldman, we have a number of your coworkers' emails that also can help you refresh your recollection. When we get to the SIG-TARP's reason for wanting to speak to you, Ms. Romero states, SIG-TARP believes that the Auto Task Force played a role in the pension decision, and these individuals' failure to speak on this issue poses a significant obstacle. Mr. Feldman, do you agree that you played a role in the pension decisions?
I don't think I agree that I played a role in the pension decisions. I certainly spoke regularly to the PBGC and to General Motors regarding the Delphi pension issues.
Did you ever speak to people at the White House concerning this issue?
Brian Deese, who was at that time at the White House, was a regular member of our team, and the team reported to Larry Summers and Tim Geithner, and obviously Mr. Summers or Dr. Summers was at the White House at that time.
Could you please put up slide 6? This is Joseph House of PBGC, his email following his conversation with you, where he says that you reported that you made progress discussing our proposal with a number of key folks in Treasury and at the White House, but he has not yet wrapped up his coordination. This would be the issue of the pensions. PBGC's emails indicating, and we have several, including this one, that indicate your role as on the Auto Task Force of coordinating the issue of the pensions. Do you disagree with this email?
I don't disagree that I was the coordinator or facilitator of those issues. I think that's accurate to say.
Then what was your role that you just said a minute ago you didn't have one?
I think you asked whether I was a decision maker, and I was not a decision maker on these issues.
I asked you to describe what your role was. Would you describe that role for us, please?
Sure. I was the facilitator, coordinator of issues between General Motors and the PBGC, among other roles, regarding the Delphi pension issues.
And how does that role assist or affect PBGC and its participation in the bankruptcy process and in the decision affecting the pensions?
Well, the decision that the PBGC made with respect to the pensions was independent of anything that Treasury or I had to say to the PBGC. The issue vis-a-vis the PBGC and Delphi was what claims the PBGC would have in the Delphi case, what liens they would purport to have over assets of Delphi, particularly the foreign assets of Delphi, and that had a large impact on Delphi's future and obviously on GM's future.
So, Mr. Feldman, you played a role in determining the either claiming or releasing of PBGC liens on General Motors Delphi assets in the bankruptcy process with respect to these pensions.
That's not correct.
That's what I heard you say. Please clarify it.
Well, let me be very clear. I urged the PBGC to come to decisions in a rapid manner because it had the potential to hold up General Motors' emergence. But I did not advocate for positions vis-a-vis the PBGC. I played the role of a facilitator or mediator, if you will, between the PBGC and General Motors.
My time has expired. Mr. Quigley.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good morning, Ms. Clowers.
Good morning.
Your audit tried to identify some of the factors that went into GM's decisions to top up some pensions and not others. That's correct, right?
It did.
Your December 2011 report states, and I quote, Treasury deferred to GM's business judgment, and Treasury did not explicitly approve or disapprove of GM providing top-ups. So it would appear from your report that the Delphi pension matter was decided by GM without Treasury influence?
Yes, we reported that while Treasury played a significant role in resolving the Delphi bankruptcy, as they wanted that resolved as quickly as possible as new GM emerged from bankruptcy, they played an advisory role with regard to the pension plan issues as laid out in court filings and interviews with GM PBGC officials and Treasury officials. I think an example of that is in a court filing that shows that Treasury assumed GM would be honoring the hourly plans up until it was informed by GM in June that it can no longer do so because of the financial burden.
Okay. And in your mind and what you wrote, what were the factors driving GM's decisions?
According to GM officials that we spoke to and the public records that we reviewed, GM considered the dependency on the UAW for the workforce. They were heavily reliant on that workforce, and so emerging from bankruptcy, they wanted to make sure they had a motivated and intact workforce. They also considered other cost and risk factors and weighed that against emerging from bankruptcy in terms of what type of cost and risk they wanted to take on.
And did you find any evidence that Delphi's pension decisions were anything other than GM's private business decisions?
Again, the court filings, the Treasury officials, PBG officials, GM officials stated that Treasury only played an advisory role. I would note, however, in conducting our work, we coordinated with SIGTARP, and our report focused on a broad range of things, including PBGC issues, the events leading to the termination, and Treasury's role, but we did not conduct an investigation as SIGTARP is doing, and we did not interview the former officials here today.
Is there anything else you want to add related to the GM decision-making process and the questions I've had?
No, sir.
All right. Thank you. I yield back.
I thank the ranking member and certainly appreciate his line of questioning as well. We'll now recognize Mr. Kelly of Pennsylvania for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for holding the hearing and allowing me to participate. I do have a question. Now, Mr. Bloom, I've been with you before in other hearings. When we talk about the boards and we talk about GM making decisions, is the consensus is that these are GM board decisions that were made involving the UAW?
I think it would depend on the decision.
But specifically with this one, when it comes to pensions and picking and choosing who would get bailed out and who would not get bailed out.
I couldn't say whether General Motors management specifically brought this issue to their board of directors or not. I wouldn't know.
Did you sit on the board of directors of General Motors?
No.
No. You were part of the auto task force?
Yes.
Okay. And the board of directors, again, the old GM versus the new GM, because there's two completely different entities there. As we know, a lot of the new General Motors were appointees by the administration. So as we move on, let me ask you this. Mr. Wilson, in your testimony, and I think this really makes a lot of sense, you talk about what happened with this, and you say on page 2, and the results of the work speak for themselves. General Motors had its most profitable year ever in 2011, even though auto sales have still not fully recovered. Now, I know we talk about the auto industry coming roaring back. Do you know what GM made in 2011?
I think it was just under $8 billion in net income.
How much taxes did they pay?
Well, they had some NOLs from the transaction.
No, how much did they pay, taxes?
I don't know.
I will tell you what it is. It's zero. It's zero. And maybe, Professor, you can tell us why they paid zero taxes on almost $8 billion in profits.
Sure, yes. This is another anomaly about these cases that are very irregular, which is that the Treasury Department issued essentially a special ruling for TARP recipients that allowed them preferential treatment on the tax code in order to carry forward net operating
Wait, can I just say, so would preferential treatment, could we just say, like on the street, would we call that picking winners and losers and who gets to take advantage of things that weren't available to others in bankruptcy?
I think that would be a very accurate description, yes.
So $7.1 billion. I'm a General Motors dealer, by the way, so I'm really happy when they make money. But I always like the fact, and the President always talks about the 99% and the 1% and how the 1% is not paying their fair share. Almost $8 billion profit, and they didn't try to put anything back in. That's offensive to me as a taxpayer. I know during the bailout, as a dealer, I didn't get 1 cent. In fact, I was at risk of losing my dealership, and the answer was, hey, you know what, good luck. You guys can probably make it if you really work hard. We made it. I understand that. But, when we talk about this auto industry roaring back, we're talking about an industry that had 16.5 million sales every year. It fell to 9.5 million sales. So the roaring back comes as a result of the fact that cars like people age. Cars like people can't perform at the same level they had when they were newer. There's a thing called the scrapping rate that's taking place. So the roaring back really is a result of a diminished market the last 3 or 4 years. So, yeah, it's going to come roaring back. It is going to come roaring back. But I think right now they're projecting somewhere, some people say 13.5 million units a year, some 14.5 million units a year. But telling you from a guy who's actually on the lot talking to people, what's keeping it from really roaring back is people just aren't sure what the future holds. They're not willing to go into a 48-month or a 60-month commitment, not knowing if they're going to have a job in that time period. So I think it's important that we really take a look at what did happen in the auto industry. And I got to tell you, Mr. Wilson, I know you're a good Republican, and I know that you're very heralded for what you do. And without objection, I'd like to enter into the testimony from City and State. An article talked about Harry Wilson tapped either Teamsters to rescue an ailing trucking company and union jobs.
Without objection, so ordered.
You do a good job at what you do. I don't think there's any question about that. And I think people in the private sector, it doesn't really matter what political affiliation you have. I mean, I sell cars. The prerequisite is they have to be a Republican to buy a car from me. I just want everybody to come in and avail themselves of the fine products that General Motors builds.
But you're in Florida, not New York.
But anyways, listen. So you do have close ties, and you're going to try and help the Trucking Association, too, because they're also in a very bad shape right now, are they not?
Yes, on that particular deal, sir, we completed that restructuring in July of 2011.
Okay, so they're back on their feet and recovering.
Yes.
But my real question, I guess it comes down to, how do we pick those we bail out and those we don't?
As a government or as a private sector?
As a government, knowing that the private sector funds all of these decisions that we make.
Sure. Well, I mean, philosophically, the way I look at it is it's almost never acceptable for the government to intervene in the private sector. And I've gotten ribbing from friends of mine who have philosophical similarities about, well, why was it okay in 2009? And the only reason I personally concluded it was okay was because we were on the edge of the abyss. No one knew where the bottom was, sir, as you remember. Yeah. You know, the S&P was at 660.
Let me ask you one thing. So the bailout was to keep General Motors from going bankrupt, right?
No, I think the rescue was done to save the entire American auto industry from going out of business.
All right. So the market would be the market. The industry fares on its own. Professor, the length of the GM bankruptcy, how many days?
Carolyn, you're next.
I don't remember exactly, but it was like 30 to 60 days from beginning to end.
So one of the biggest bankruptcy cases ever is solved in 30 to 60 days.
That's what we are led to believe, yes.
So if we don't use what was ultimately used and we let I'm sorry, my time's up. I just wanted to see if it had gone through a normal bankruptcy, what would the recovery time have been also? So I apologize.
Gentleman can answer the question, then we'll move forward.
If it had gone through normal recovery, if it had gone through normal bankruptcy, it would have taken somewhat longer, but it would have been a lot more transparent. We could have had a real 363 sale. We could have not shredded the rule of law in terms of priorities and those sorts of things. So it may have taken a little bit longer, but there's no reason why we had to do all the things that we did in order to all this other stuff in order to fix the auto companies.
I thank the gentleman for his testimony. We'll now recognize Ms. Maloney of New York for 5 minutes.
I want to thank the gentleman, and I want to thank all of the panelists for being here. And actually, I want to thank President Obama for saving the auto industry in America. I, for one, can't imagine an America that doesn't build our own cars. And granted, it's not where it was, but we saved at least 1 million jobs, and we're now exporting cars. And we seem to be doing a good job. We got to remember when President Obama took office, the industry was shedding jobs by hundreds of thousands, and GM and Chrysler faced the possibility of being totally liquidated, which would then have a huge ramifications. Even in New York, we had suppliers in New York that were supplying the auto industry, and they went out of business, and many New Yorkers lost their jobs. We weren't building the cars, but we were building some of the parts. So it had ramifications across our great nation. And yet when the American auto industry was on the brink of collapse, and we were going to lose, by all estimates from all economists, at least 1 million jobs on the line, that would have been at least 1 in 8 jobs in Ohio and in jobs across our country. And it wasn't just the people in the auto plants. We got to remember this. This industry affected everyone. It affected the suppliers. hundreds of thousands of miles away and up and down the chain. It affected the restaurants near the plants, every store, every school, everyone in the community, the families that depended on the worker that was at that plant. And I remember some people said, let Detroit go bankrupt. Let it go down the drain. Even a guy running for president said that. But our president said, no, we're going to save the auto industry. And quite frankly, I'm proud of the auto industry. I'm proud of their comeback. And I think it's an American success story that America bet on the American worker and bet on American industry. And GM is back. Now it's the #1 company in the world. Ford is on the move, was handled extremely well during that whole crisis. They did extremely well. Chrysler is back. And I think that supporting with policies the American worker and American business, I think it's a success story. So I want to applaud everyone on the panel or everyone who played any role whatsoever in saving an American industry, which is now exporting cars. Now, I'd like to point out and put in the record the GAO highlights first page. And I want to quote from it because there's some confusion about Treasury's role. And I'd like to say, and I'm going to quote exactly from their report, although acknowledging the significant role Treasury played in GM's restructuring, GM and Treasury officials stated that Treasury's role was advisory concerning GM's decisions and not to take on additional Delphi pension liabilities, but to honor the top-up agreements with some unions. Also, PBGC officials stated that PBGC independently made the decision to terminate the plans. So I would like to put that in the record because it clarifies the independent voice of GAO. And I know that we have a representative here, and we have some questions for Ms. Clowers. But I first want to ask Mr. Bloom, Mr. Feldman, and Mr. Wilson, and I want to thank them first for testifying. And they're out there, aren't they? Yep. Yep. I don't have my glasses. I can't see. So I regret I was at a hearing in financial services I had to attend, and I didn't hear all of it, but I read your testimony. I want to know, what was your overall mission as members of the Auto Task Force? Delphi was just one piece of the situation that you were facing, and Delphi was a major parts supplier to GM that had been experiencing its own financial troubles for some time. If you saved GM, but Delphi failed, all of your efforts would have been for nothing. Is that correct? Can you, your answer?
Yeah, I think I'd echo what Mr. Wilson had said earlier. Our mission was not to save General Motors. Our mission was to see if there were a way to facilitate the restructuring of these companies so that the American automobile industry in its entirety could continue to function at the least possible cost to taxpayer. It was General Motors' judgment, which we did not disagree with, that if Delphi had liquidated, General Motors' ability to reorganize would have been put seriously at risk.
Well, my time is up, and I think that says it all. So I think your judgment was right. We are employing it, saved over 1 million jobs. We're exporting. I would call that an American success story. Congratulations for any role you did to support it.
Time expired. Mr. Genta, the Vice Chair, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to make a statement and a comment, and I want to yield some additional time to Mr. Kelly. What I'm hearing from this testimony is that had this action not taken place, that America would be forever changed, that the Federal Government had no choice but to act. There's a lot of people in this country that disagree with that assessment. There's a lot of people in this country that disagree with that assessment. There are a lot of people in this country who believe in America, that a federal government should be limited and effective and efficient. I happen to be one of those Americans. And I find it somewhat offensive that people in this committee, in this panel, feel that only the federal government could act to save the private sector. And we talk about the size and scope of General Motors. Fannie Mae is actually larger than General Motors. So under the auspice of the federal government had to act to save this industry, apparently you're also suggesting and admitting that we're going to have to act to save Fannie Mae. I'm not sure that people in this country believe in that either. There's one question I have for Mr. Wilson. Did unions get special treatment in this bailout? Yes or no?
No.
In your opinion?
No.
Okay. Mr. Zawicki, in your opinion, did unions get special treatment in this bailout?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay. Why do you think that?
As we document in our paper, first, they were treated better with respect to their VBAs in the General Motors cases than other unsecured creditors were treated. Second, they were treated much better than employees typically are treated in bankruptcy cases, and they're allowed to retain wages that are frankly above market wages, above any of their competitors' wages, and were thereby prevented from having to do what typically happens. And third, there was really no justification for giving $1 billion to the retirees of another company, which is what they did with respect to Delphi.
So, Mr. Wilson, is Mr. Zawicki telling the truth or is he lying?
I don't think he's lying. I think he's just mistaken, and woefully so.
So you don't think what he said actually happened?
I think he's got the facts completely wrong, and I'd be happy to go through great detail if you'd like.
Explain to me in 15 seconds how he's wrong.
Well, there's no way to explain $26 billion of mischaracterizations in 15 seconds. I'd be happy to explain it in great detail.
$26 billion?
That was his claim.
Okay.
And so but again, I'm happy to go, and you're happy to. Of course, you'll cut me off if you at any time you want to. But if you look at each of the three pieces, sir, we negotiated the best possible deal we could with each of the constituencies, with both the UAW and with the bondholders. The bondholders overwhelmingly approved the General Motors bankruptcy deal. Overwhelmingly. If they felt they were being disadvantaged, they were people who held $28 billion in claims. They could have voted with their feet, and they chose not to because they felt the deal was a fair deal. So that's why his first point is completely wrong. His second point is also completely wrong. We were governed in all our actions by the Corker amendments. Senator Corker, who's an honorable and wonderful senator, put forward a bunch of stipulations in the early TARP work that said that GM's wage rates had to equal, and Chrysler's, but I focus on General Motors, GM's wage rates had to equal Toyota's. And that was a aspect of long negotiations in terms of what does that mean.
Let me reclaim my time. The question was there special treatment or preferential treatment given to union members? It sounds like you're doing a lot of explaining and telling me why that's not the case.
Right.
I disagree with you. I think it's very clear that there was special preferential treatment given to one group over another. Now, you're free to disagree with me, but it is pretty clear that's exactly what happened. Let me ask about you. Have you gotten any preferential treatment since your work with unions on this from unions?
Of course not.
Of course not. You have not done any work since this with any union?
Yes, I've done work since then, but that's not preferential treatment, sir. I actually completely resent the implication. Do you have any evidence to suggest that, sir?
I'm asking the question.
I asked to answer the question.
I'd like to know, okay, so what work are you doing with unions now?
The Teamsters approached me because I've had enormous success in restructuring broken businesses in many walks of life, almost entirely as a private investor. And they asked for my help in their largest employer, YRC, which we successfully restructured out of court, the largest out-of-court restructuring done in many years in record time. And because of that success, they've asked me to work with them in other situations. But I've also worked with private investors. I've worked on my own. I've been on the other side of the table from unions, both before and since. So it's just, I'm an investor and restructuring expert, and I work in situations to try to fix companies before they go away.
Okay. Thank you very much for your testimony. I will yield back the balance of my time to the Chair.
I thank my colleague for yielding back. We'll now recognize Mr. Johnson of Ohio for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and to the rest of the subcommittee members for granting unanimous consent to allow me to participate in today's important hearing. As you may know, I represent Ohio's 6th congressional district, which includes parts of northeastern Ohio and the southern suburbs of Youngstown. A large number of Delphi retirees, both salaried and unsalaried, live in the district that I represent. Since I was elected to Congress in 2010, I've been looking closely at the reason why one class of workers, the union retirees, were given preferential treatment over the non-union salary retirees. It's now been almost 20 months, and I still have not heard a compelling reason as to why this was done, and today I hoped that this hearing would produce answers to those questions that many of us have been asking. Mr. Bloom, last year when you were still employed by the Obama administration, I asked you whether or not that all parties involved were treated fairly and received neither more nor less than they would have simply because the government was involved. Do you still believe today that all parties were treated fairly?
Yes.
Did the newly restructured General Motors have any contractual obligations to top up the union retirees' pensions?
I'm sorry, the newly restructured General Motors?
Did the newly restructured General Motors have any contractual obligations to top up the union retirees' pensions?
I believe that the newly restructured General Motors, as part of their bankruptcy settlement with the UAW, reaffirmed their commitment to top up the pensions of the Delphi retirees.
Was it a contractual obligation?
I believe it was part of their contract with the UAW, yes.
Okay. How can you say that all parties were treated fairly when the union retirees kept their full pensions while you and others raised the pension funding status 100% and the union retirees kept one of the best health care plans in the U.S.? On the other hand, the salary retirees lost up to 70% of their pension plans and their health care. You know, I mean, I learned this principle in kindergarten. Fair is fair. How can you give one group 100% and take 70% from another group and call that fair?
Well, first thing I'd say that the union retirees at General Motors did not retain the health care program they had before. They received a VEBA, which is going to be responsible for providing the health care that does not have sufficient funds to provide the benefits they used to have, number one. Number two, when I used the word fair, I did not use the word equal. In a bankruptcy, all constituents, and Mr. Feldman made this point earlier, all constituents try to use whatever leverage they have to try to get the best arrangement they can. It was General Motors' business judgment that the overall deal they made with the UAW was fair and the cheapest deal they could make.
Mr. Bloom, I hate to cut you off. I appreciate your explanation. Reclaiming my time, Mr. Bloom, I appreciate your explanation, but I'm running out of time. It's an interesting nuance that now we've changed the definition. There's a difference between fair treatment and equal treatment under the law. That I don't understand. But Mr. Zawicki, it's clear to me and many of my colleagues and the public that the Obama administration's auto bailout staff used taxpayer dollars to pick winners and losers, and now it seems in an effort to not embarrass the President in a very contentious reelection campaign, members of the auto bailout team have refused to be interviewed by the Inspector General on their actions. Now, we know they've agreed to today, but up until now it hasn't happened. Tens of thousands of salary retirees saw their retirement funds greatly reduced by up to 70%, while the union retirees were made whole and were even topped up. Do you think it was fair?
Equal and fair sound pretty much the same to me, Congressman. And I would also say to Mr. Guinta's earlier question, which is he asked whether or not the unions are giving preferential treatment. What I heard Mr. Wilson say was that he justified preferential treatment, that he thought was reasonable. But I don't think there's any question the unions are given preferential treatment.
Mr. Zawicki, thank you for your answer. I'd like to yield my last 20 seconds to my colleague from Ohio, Mr. Turner, for a follow-up question.
Mr. Bloom, you were saying that there was a contractual obligation with respect to the top-ups. Those don't survive in bankruptcy, right? So they were free to either affirm or not affirm them. So you can't say that it was a contractual obligation, therefore they must. They were in bankruptcy, correct?
What I think I said was, in the General Motors bankruptcy, General Motors made a contract with the UAW. That contract included affirming the prior agreement relative to the Delphi retirees.
I think you were leaving the impression that with the committee that there was some obligation within bankruptcy, and they had no obligation within bankruptcy. It was one that they affirmed, correct?
That's what I said.
Thank you.
I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
I thank my colleague for yielding back, and with that, we will I will begin a second round of questions for the panel. Now, Mr. Wilson, I just want to make sure that this is for the record. My colleague from Pennsylvania, Mr. Kelly, submitted for the record a newspaper article called City and State from the city, and I'm sorry, pardon me? Mr. Genta submitted that for the record. There's a quote in here, and I think this is the implication of Mr. Genta. It's not to impugn your character in any way. I understand you took great offense to that, but simply saying, a quote from this in regards to, this is a quote from Mr. Gold, the Teamsters Director of Strategic Research and Campaigns. Quote, "We're not at liberty to discuss any details, but we approached Mr. Harry Wilson, after closely following the work on the Obama administration's auto task force. And given the similarities that GM faces and YRCW faces, we believe he would be a tremendous help in fixing this challenging situation." Now, that's the quote from this. The implication is that you're pretty agreeable to the unions, and based on their experience. It's not about impugning your character in any way, shape, or form. When you testify that you've got these Republican credentials, you're testifying as an Obama administration official. He's not talking about your character. He's just simply saying that your actions in public life have been agreeable to unions. And I just want to make sure that's corrected for the record, and that's established. In no way it is a character assassination. That is the context of his questions and comments. And I want to move on. There is and I want to ask the three auto bailout task force folks, Mr. Bloom, Mr. Feldman, Mr. Wilson, about this, and I want to get your comments on the record. Stephen Ratner, the Obama administration's former car czar and one of your former colleagues and boss, admitted to the Detroit Economic Club this past December, quote, "We should have asked the UAW to do a bit more." You can see the quote on the screen here. "We did not ask any UAW member to take a cut in their pay," end quote. Do you agree that with Mr. Ratner that, in retrospect, you should have asked the UAW to make more concessions? Mr. Bloom?
I haven't seen Mr. Ratner's speech, so I don't know the broader context, and I certainly don't know what he means by a bit. So I can't comment specifically.
No, I'm asking you to comment.
If your question is, but if you ask me if I agree with him, I can't tell you whether I agree with him. I can answer your question. If your question is, do I think we should have asked the UAW to do more, my answer is no.
No.
No, I think what we did was reasonable.
Okay. So no pay cut, fine and dandy.
I think the aggregate deal that General Motors extracted from the UAW was reasonable.
Okay. Mr. Feldman?
Again, I don't know what the context of Steve's
well, let me restate
quote is, but what I would say about the UAW is you have to remember Chrysler went first. Chrysler's negotiation with the UAW was really led by Fiat. So the deal that they established, which became part of the pattern bargaining in General Motors, was done between two third parties, did not have task force intervention, no thumbs on the scale. So in hindsight, I'm perfectly content with where everything came out.
Perfectly content. So no, the answer is no.
The answer is no.
Okay. Thank you. Mr. Wilson?
Sure, Mr. Chairman. I've said publicly that I believe that the only kind of remaining legacy issue of General Motors is pension underfunding, which is an issue and a drag on its stock, an issue for the company, and that I wish that the restructuring had addressed that in some way. It was the judgment of General Motors management in their negotiations with the UAW that they would keep the pension intact, and we didn't intervene in that, consistent with our mandate. But I believe that that's an issue that could have been better addressed in bankruptcy.
So the answer is yes?
So I think more could have been done.
More could have been done. Okay. Okay. Well, thank you for answering the question. I wanted to give you the opportunity to respond. This was in Mr. Zawicki's testimony. Mr. Feldman, we have, if you'll put up slide 2 on the screen here, you'll see an email that you sent on June 30th, 2009. I recognize that you're not going to have instant recollection of this. In your email, you asked GM to bring the UAW into the loop about negotiations over the termination of Delphi pension plans, stating that it could get, quote, could get messy. The Obama administration contended that it would not get involved in the day-to-day affairs of GM. Was it your place to advise GM to talk with the UAW? And was this advice based on prudent bankruptcy proceedings, or was this more about political expediency?
I don't think it was about either bankruptcy or political expediency. I think if you go back to that moment in time, basically the PBGC had made the determination that it was going to terminate both the hourly plan and the salary plan. It had previously made the decision on the salary plan. And really what I was doing was reminding General Motors that given their relationships with the UAW, that they needed to get out in front of the communications, not substantive advice to General Motors.
Well, this was prior to the PBGC terminating the plan.
Correct, but I think if you look, if I recall, and I don't have perfect recall, but I think if you recall, the PBGC at that point had started its process of thinking about a termination of the Delphi hourly and salaried plans.
All right. Thank you for putting that on the record. With that, we'll for the second round, we'll go to Mr. Cummings, and as I went, what was my total time? 6 minutes. I'll recognize the ranking member for 6 minutes.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Sorry that Mr. Ginter had to leave. I'm sure he had another engagement, but he said something that was very interesting. He said there's some folks that feel that only the federal government could bail out folks and whatever, make corporations run. I don't want to take the words out of his mouth, but that's what he implied. I don't think that there's anyone over on this side that thinks that only the federal government can do what the federal government was able to do. I mean, in other words, there are times when the federal government has to step in, and I am glad that the federal government did step in this situation because we were able to save millions of jobs. And I know that there are people who are working right now who would say, thank you very, very much for saving my job. There are people who, when their child got that notice about college, being accepted to a college, they don't have to do what the guy did in the commercial, drop his head. They're able to say, okay, I can afford that college. We can do this. There are others that are able to provide food on the tables for their families. There are others that are able to live the life that they want to live as opposed to being on the sidelines of life drawing an unemployment check. So I'm glad that President Obama and this team did what they did. In November 18th, in the November 18th, 2008 New York Times op-ed entitled, "Let Detroit Go Bankrupt," Mitt Romney wrote, and I quote, "A managed bankruptcy may be the only path to the fundamental restructuring the industry needs. The federal government should provide guarantees for post-bankruptcy financing and assure car buyers that their warranties are not at risk." Mr. Romney predicted that as a result of direct government assistance to the auto industries, and I quote, "its demise will be virtually guaranteed," end of quote. Mr. Wilson, has Mr. Romney gotten it right? Nearly 4 years since Mr. Romney wrote those words, is GM showing signs that it is guaranteed to fail?
So I'm going to try not to interject myself into the presidential debate, but I think
no, I just want you are at Harvard, and that's another thing. I was very impressed. A lot of people don't realize this. You are an honor graduate of Harvard College and then the business school at Harvard. And so I don't want anybody to think that you're some lightweights. That's why I'm asking you. No, I'm serious. I mean, I heard what they said about you, and I'm going to ask you some questions about your background a little bit later, but you can go ahead and answer the question.
Sure. No, I think the results, Congressman Cummings, speak for themselves. I think that GM had its most profitable year ever in its 103-year history in 2011, even though auto sales still have not recovered back to their normalized level. And I think it has a cost structure and a capital structure that have made it the largest and most profitable car maker in the world. So I think as long as they keep on the same path, they maintain the same discipline that they now have, I believe the company has a bright future.
Steve Ratner, the former head of the Auto Task Force, wrote in a February 24, 2012 New York Times op-ed that Mr. Romney's proposal, quote, sounds like a wonderfully sensible approach, except that it's utter fantasy, end of quote. Mr. Ratner further wrote that, and I quote, every scrap of private capital had fled to the sidelines, end of quote, and without government financing initiated by President George W. Bush in December 2008, the companies would not have been able to pursue Chapter 11 reorganization. Measures Mr. Wilson, Mr. Bloom, Mr. Feldman, is Mr. Ratner's assessment correct? Do you agree that there simply were no other options available aside from complete liquidation on the path or the path that was taken? We'll start with you, Mr. Bloom.
It was our judgment, and I have no reason to question it. And it was based on extensive talking in the market and plus our own experience, our collective experience, that if the government had not provided the debtor-in-possession financing, that General Motors would not have been able, would have had to liquidate.
Mr. Feldman?
I completely agree. I mean, we were in touch with the largest financial institutions in the world. They were simply not going to provide capital. We spoke to the largest private equity funds in the world. They were talking about needing 9 months to due diligence General Motors to make a determination as to whether they'd make an investment. It was simply, the U.S. government, unfortunately, was a lender of last resort, but it was the only lender in my view.
Mr. Wilson?
That's correct, sir. I talked about in my written testimony this unique confluence of events of both the failure of the companies at the time of a complete freeze in the financial markets. And it was those two things that made this so unusual. In normal times, even in bad economic normal times, you can find private capital. We beat the bushes to try to find private capital, and there was no one willing to step forward any kind of reasonable terms or any terms at all to fund even a few $1 billion, much less the $80 billion we needed to effectuate the rescue. One private equity firm approached us and said they would put in $1 billion, so we're still $79 billion short, if we guaranteed them an 8% return. Now, what would the reaction of the taxpayer have been, or this panel, had someone agreed to do that? It should have been rightfully outraged. And, of course, we said no. And so that was the state of the world in which we lived in March of 2009 and the context in which we had to make decisions.
I guess it's easy for people to sit in the bleachers, look down at the game, and then try to second-guess the efforts of the team, and even when the team wins, and wins big time, sit on the sidelines and criticize the calls in the game. That's just my opinion. I yield back.
Mr. Kelly?
Thank you, Chairman. Just so we can be clear on this, and I sometimes get confused. I've only been here for a year and a half, but I think that the confusion comes, are we in Washington, D.C., or are we on Mount Olympus? Because the decisions made by government, really, we talk about they bailed out the auto industry. I'm going to tell you what bailed out the auto industry. Being a guy who's sold cars his whole life and a family that's been in it over 60 years, it is the market that saved the auto industry. And we are not talking, by the way, gentlemen, about union jobs and non-union jobs, Republican jobs and Democrat jobs. We're talking about American jobs. There is such a fragility to this market, and I really get confused sometimes when people who have never actually done it can tell you exactly what caused this. I mean, wow, I can tell you what caused it. Overcapacity, overproduction. When you're structured to do 16.5 million units a year and it goes down to 9 million units a year, my goodness, do you think you have a problem when you've lost over 40% of your market? The answer is yes. The government interfered with a natural flow of the business cycle. They picked winners and losers. There is absolutely no doubt that they picked winners and losers. This idea that we have an evolving truth, that as time goes forward, we can talk about what is fair and what is equal. that we can pick and choose winners and losers and then sit back and say, but if we hadn't done it, you'd understand, the market would have collapsed. The market did collapse. It collapsed because people didn't know what their future looked like. A guy who doesn't know if he's going to have a job next year does not go into a 48-month commitment or a 60-month commitment to buy a new car. How do I know this? I stand on the lot with them, I sit in the showrooms with them, and I see their pain. But whenever you determine that one group will be bailed out and another will not, that is just flat outright wrong. Let's not become confused. This is pure folly that it had not been for this measure. All the manufacturers would have collapsed. Are you kidding me? Do you know that there were auto manufacturers that actually gained market share during that time period? The market, not government, determines success and failure. What happened to this situation is that the government decided who wins, who loses, who gets fully funded, who gets nothing, who gets to sit at the table and eat, and who gets to sit outside. Let there be no confusion over the definition between fair and equal. In the country that I grew up in, it's the same thing. And I get sick and tired when people use a legal argument to do an end run on what's right for the American people. That's absolutely pathetic. And if that's what we've reverted to, no wonder the American people don't have faith in this institution anymore. No wonder they don't have any faith in a judicial system anymore that picks and chooses winners and losers. Oh yeah, you can fight it if you have enough money. I got to tell you, and you know it, and I know it, and everybody else knows it in this country. I am not against the unions. Listen, I love the unions. I love what they do. But why did you bring them to the table? And there's an old saying right now that I really believe in. If you're not at the table, you're on the menu. This government picked and chose who the winners and the losers were. The recovery of the American automobile industry has nothing to do with this. There would still have been companies. These companies would have gone through a bankruptcy, would have come back. We didn't save millions of jobs. A bankruptcy with historical, what a recovery period. Biggest bankruptcy in American history. Bam, 30, 60 days, we're back on the street and running again and no problems. So when we talk about what's clear and what's transparent, when we talk about what's fair, we talk about the 99% and the 1%, fairness to me is pretty much handpicked. Well, I'll be fair with certain people, but I won't be fair with others. Mr. Chairman, I appreciate the hearing today, and I know there's some confusion about it from having been there and having to navigate through those very difficult times. Keep in mind one thing. It is the market that will always be the opportunity. How you address that market, your ability to compete in a market that's global, your ability to build cars of the highest quality has never been contested. You know what the problem was? It costs too much to build them here. American people go out, and the people I talk to, you know what they look at? How much is it going to cost me a month? So that's what it comes down to. And I'm going to yield back, but I got to tell you, having been there and having been in those waters, without a life jacket, without anybody throwing me a line, it's offensive to me that somebody was picked to win and the other people were picked to lose.
The gentleman yield.
I do.
Just one, and I have tremendous respect for you, and I know you know that. And I just want to make sure I understand. Are you saying that that this situation could have gone into bankruptcy and we would have still had the results that we have? Is that what you're trying to say?
Well, reclaiming my time.
Yeah, please. I said this most respectfully.
Yeah, and I appreciate that, Mr. Cummings, because you and I do have a good relationship. It did go through bankruptcy, and it came back. The question is, who was made whole, who was made partial, who was left out in the cold? And I want to tell you, gentlemen, I appreciate you being here today. It took a year. It took a year to come. It took a year to answer these things from SIGTARP? Really? Now, I have a passion for this, too. In fact, my friends say to me all the time, Kelly, you don't make any sense to me. You left what was probably the next to the last on the list of what people respect me in the automobile business, and you went to the worst. We rely on you. You are the people who we rely on for the answers. And when you don't testify, what does that look like? Tell me. Not in legal jargon, but in common sense, everyday American jargon. What does that look like to the people who pay for all this? The American taxpayers. It's pathetic. The fact that you can do it and that you take advantage of it is even more pathetic. I yield back my time.
Thank you. As we proceed with additional questions, I just want to remind everyone that the topic of this hearing is the administration's auto bailouts and the Delphi pensions decisions. Who picked the winners and losers? It is not the issue of the auto bailout itself, the bankruptcy itself. It's what happened with the Delphi pension decisions. We're having this hearing because these three gentlemen refused to answer questions. Mr. Bloom agreed to answer written questions for me a year ago at a hearing, refused since to answer them, and these three gentlemen have refused to answer SIGTARP's questions. The GAO report is not sufficient. We need the SIGTARP report. And so with that clarification, I'll turn then to Ms. Maloney, and then after her question, then we'll open it up to an unlimited time period, since Mr. Bloom indicated that the only way he's going to answer the questions that he had promised Congress that he would answer a year ago in writing is to be asked those questions in this hearing room. I will stay and ask him those questions. Ms. Maloney.
Gentlemen, just for 1 second, one question. Just, Mr. Chairman.
Yes.
I just want to make it clear. Is that, I just want to be clear on this. Did Mr. Bloom, I've been here and I listened, did he say the only way that he would answer the question is to answer it?
He's before us, Mr. Bloom.
I mean, is that what you said?
If you would answer these in writing, and you said that you would not, I certainly intend to ask you these questions here because of that. Your answer stands in the record.
Yeah, what I said was, if you want to go through these questions, I'm here today. I also said I would talk to SIGTARP. If you'd like to have SIGTARP ask me these questions, I'll do it.
But you refused to provide me in writing the answers that you promised, and we showed the video,
as I said,
before this committee previously in writing.
I responded to that already.
Sorry, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just wanted clarification.
Sorry, thank you. Ms. Maloney.
Well, pertaining to the pension, I would say that members of Congress recognize and sympathize with the pain that many Delphi workers are experiencing since GM decided not to top up their pensions. And since everybody seems to want to attack Mr. Bloom, I'll just ask him, do you recognize that pain too, Mr. Bloom, that of some people who were not made whole?
Of course. Speaking personally and to my knowledge, everybody on the Auto Task Force understood and had great sympathy for all of the people involved in this tragic circumstance who had to make sacrifices. The Delphi salaried employees are on the list, but unfortunately, Congresswoman, the list is very long. And as I've said repeatedly, our judgment was, on balance, while there was terrible suffering, much greater suffering was averted. But that in no way is to suggest that there was not suffering.
Well, I agree with your statement. Had Delphi failed, had GM failed, not only would their workers have suffered, but also the entire communities. And I would say our overall economic health of our country would have been much worse. I'd like to take issue with the prior gentleman's statement that he said that it could have been handled and it would have worked itself out on its own. But I want to reference and put into a record a November 17th publication of 2010. And this publication is entitled, "The Impact on the United States Economy of the Successful Automaker Bankruptcies." And this was issued by the Center for Automotive Research. So this is an independent validation. And in this research, which is independent from the GAO research that basically says the same thing, the government's actions avoided personal income losses totaling over $96 billion and avoided 1.1 million net job losses in 2009 and another 314,000 in 2010. So, Mr. Bloom, since everybody wants you to answer the questions, I'll ask you. And Mr. Feldman, Mr. Wilson, if you'd like to comment, is that correct? Do you agree with this independent source? Had it not been for the government intervention, your work for crucial months in 2009, could the country have experienced more than 1 million net job losses? And I predict it's even more. The impact even hit New York State for the suppliers that went out of business that were supplying the auto industry. So I just wonder, do you agree with the statement from this independent research organization?
I haven't reviewed the exact
Well, it basically says, had we not acted, we would have lost 1.1 million.
But our judgment at the time and the material I've seen since then that I've reviewed that suggests that the losses would have been very significant in jobs. Carr has said 1 million. Others have used larger numbers. Mark Zandi recently said 2.5 million jobs were at risk. So I'm not enough of an economist to choose between them, but I think our judgment that the losses could have been quite catastrophic has been confirmed.
Well, I just want to ask you, Mr. Bloom, has any member of Congress congratulated you and thanked you for your hard work in what resulted in, by all accounts, saving over 1 million jobs that impacted many of our great states like Ohio, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Missouri, and Illinois? They're all interrelated in the supply chain of the auto industry. I just would like to ask Mr. Bloom, Mr. Feldman, and Mr. Wilson, has any member of Congress ever thanked you? Today, I want to thank you for your public service. I want to thank you for your hard work in saving American jobs, and I would say saving American industry and prestige. I personally cannot even think of an America that doesn't make our own cars. And now we've bounced back with that American spirit, can do, and are even exporting cars and employing people and growing. I just want to know, has any member of Congress said thank you?
Congressman, I very much appreciate your kind words. From time to time, other members of Congress have acknowledged that some good things happened.
Mr. Feldman, has anyone ever thanked you? I thank you today. Has anyone ever thanked you?
I appreciate that, Congresswoman. I think this is the first time I've been thanked.
Well, thank you very much. You're an American hero. I appreciate your hard work. Mr. Wilson.
Thank you as well, Congresswoman. I've had a few Democrats and Republicans thank me over time, but it's always nice to hear it. Thank you.
Well, I think more of us should be saying thank you. Thank you for your public service, and you saved jobs, you helped America, you grew our economy. Thank you.
Ms. Romero, I would like to thank you for bringing forth the light that these three gentlemen have refused to talk to you, and for your bringing it to our attention in a way where we could pull them before us and get them to talk to us, to commit to talk to you. We're going to go to a 10-minute round of questionings. My next questions are going to be for Mr. Feldman. I do want to say, I do have a quick question for you, Ms. Romero, first. You said in your letter that you believed SIGTARP believes that the Auto Task Force played a role in the pension decision, in the pension decision, and these individuals' failure to speak are a significant obstacle. You do believe that, right? That they played a role.
Yes.
Thank you, Mr. Feldman. We're going to spend a significant amount of time on the issue of what you did, what your role was, because that's really what you guys aren't speaking about. I mean, the whole questions from SIGTARP, GAO, this Congress, have been, what did you do? What was your role? What was the basis of the decision-making? Now, I'm going to read you your bio that I'm assuming you either approved or wrote yourself. Mr. Feldman was recruited to serve as Chief Legal Advisor for the Obama Administrator's Task Force on the Auto Industry. This Cabinet-level Treasury Department task force was assembled to, quoting your bio, help develop the overall strategy to restructure and recapitalize General Motors Corporation and Chrysler, a quote-unquote strategy which resulted in the groundbreaking legal proceedings that implemented a comprehensive financial solution for both companies. Now, SIGTARP believes that you were involved. You said you were negotiating among the parties. Could you please, I understand that from an absolute legal standpoint that PBGC is a party to this and has an ability to make its own decision in settlement negotiations. But they didn't do that in a vacuum, right, Mr. Feldman? They had you running in between a bunch of different other people, making proposals to PBGC as to what they should or should not do. Now, isn't that correct, Mr. Feldman?
I think really what they would or would not be willing to do, and to just take a step back, the auto team, which was the working group at Treasury that reported to the Auto Task Force, was really charged with helping restructure Chrysler and General Motors, we took on additional tasks that were critical to those two entities, including the financing arms of Chrysler, the financing arm of General Motors, and then ultimately Delphi, because General Motors was providing funding, and really at the time we got involved was really the sole source of funding for Delphi. But we did not. Go ahead. I don't. You can take back.
Thank you. Going to the issue then, using your language instead of mine, of determining what they would or wouldn't do. Who are the parties that you ran in between of doing the negotiating, determining the would or wouldn't do? Because, I mean, would or wouldn't, it's still going to PBGC and saying, someone would like you to do X, will you do X, right?
The PBGC and General Motors were the main parties involved in making decisions about, well, the PBGC was the main party involved in making decisions about the termination of Delphi's pension plans. What the impact of that was had an impact on General Motors, and I was playing essentially shuttle diplomacy between General Motors and the PBGC, which candidly didn't get along very well.
And who else?
On that issue?
Yeah.
I mean, I reported to the auto team, but I didn't, there wasn't a, I'm not thinking of a party that was directly involved in that.
You didn't share any information about what the package was in developing this strategy that's in your bio with individuals at the White House, with individuals at Treasury? I mean, is that what your testimony is?
Well, I worked for Treasury, so certainly I reported to the auto team.
Outside of the auto team?
I kept George Madison informed.
In Treasury, outside of the auto team?
George Madison was General Counsel of Treasury, not part of the auto team. I was in the legal department at Treasury, and so I did keep Mr. Madison updated. He was the General Counsel of Treasury. But in terms of the White House, the only people I ever spoke to at the White House was Brian Deese and Larry Summers.
Okay, we're going to turn to emails now. We have a July 6th email from Joseph House at PBGC. This one we don't have on the top.
Okay.
It's a July 6th email, 9:45 p.m., so he's emailing late. And he said, I just spoke with Matt Feldman, who relayed the following, quote, we agreed that any settlement discussions would be best saved for direct coordination between U.S. Treasury and PBGC at this point, rather than a subject of group coordination. Now, he's saying that the settlement discussions were, at that point, as a result of his conversation with you, a direct coordination between Treasury and PBGC. He does not mention General Motors. Do you disagree with his email?
You'd have to ask Mr. House what he meant by the email, but I interpret what he meant to mean that we were going to talk to the PBGC, and then we, meaning Treasury, were going to talk to General Motors. The Treasury did not play a role or did not have authority to settle issues between the PBGC and General Motors.
But you did have a role in making recommendations and making proposals.
I would certainly comment on proposals and recommendations. The PBGC would ask me, did I think this something would be acceptable? General Motors would say, do you think the PBGC would find something acceptable? I certainly gave them my judgment.
Well, what occurred after the July 6th email, again, I'm going to read that one again. This is Joseph House saying that he had just spoken to you and that he agreed with you that any settlement discussions would be saved for direct coordination between Treasury and PBGC rather than group coordination, is followed by the email that I showed you previously, which is slide 6, on July 8th. If we could have slide 6, please. Where, again, Mr. House is reporting that he'd spoken to you, and this one is 6:23 p.m., and this is July 8th. So subsequent to your reported agreement by Mr. House that we're going to directly coordinate this settlement negotiation between Treasury and PBGC, he then reports that you say that Feldman reported that he made progress discussing our proposal with a number of key folks in Treasury and at White House, but has not yet wrapped up his coordination. Let's turn to slide 5 then. Feldman, well, this is July 15th, 10:57 a.m. Again, this is Karen Morris, forwarding one from John Minke, and it says, Feldman will then take it to GM and get their approval, which will either be a rubber stamp one last chance to nick us on the deal. We all accept that PBGC has the legal authority with respect to its decision-making. We also know that it did that in the environment of the pressure of these negotiations, and we also understand that there were a number of parties who had positions and roles and proposals as to what PBGC should do, or, as using your language, would or wouldn't do. And Mr. Feldman, we'd like to get a better understanding of that, which is why you've been called before this committee and why SIGTARP wants to talk to you, because they believe that you were actively involved in the decision-making. Now, I'm going to ask you a very simple question. I'm assuming that with respect to the Delphi salaried pensions, that the proposals that ended up with the pensions being cut were not solely generated by PBGC, that in the negotiations with your liaison with the White House, others in Treasury outside of the Auto Task Force, and General Motors, that they had positions and recommendations as to how those pensions should be handled. Is that correct?
I never had a conversation, nor do I recall any conversations where we told the PBGC how the...
I didn't ask you that.
I'm sorry.
I asked you
I got lost
whether or not anyone else had a position or a proposal in your shuttle negotiations with respect to the Delphi salaried pensions other than PBGC. That's a pretty simple question. I would assume the answer has to be yes.
I don't believe so, not with respect to the salaried.
So you're testifying under oath before this committee that at no time did anyone else that you were working with in your position as the chief legal advisor shuttling negotiations, no one else offered you and no one else provided you any other proposal with respect to the Delphi salaried pensions in any aspect?
Let me correct it. Delphi, certainly, its position was it wanted to retain the pension plans and have General Motors pay for it or assume it. That as I recall, the time frame is a little bit fuzzy, but as I recall, Delphi certainly did not want to give up its pension plans in the early stages of my involvement.
Anyone else have a position or a proposal with respect to those pensions during your settlement negotiations?
I don't want to be unequivocal, but not that I recall.
Because you were before. Well, that's part of the subject matter of this investigation and SIGTARP's investigation. So I wish you well in your recollection process with the...
Well, I'm happy to look at more emails or other information you might
Excellent.
have, but I don't recall it.
Excellent. Mr. Cummings.
Mr. Chairman, just out of curiosity, are you planning to end the hearing now, or are you getting ready to just go on and on and on?
No, I'm going next to Mr. Bloom for him to answer the questions that he's now refusing to answer in writing that he had promised Congress in June of last year that he would answer in writing, because he invited those questions. And I will entertain, with your concurrence, the dismissal of the other panel members if there are no other questions for those other panel members, so Mr. Bloom can stand and before us and answer the questions he's refused to answer.
Well, that's fine with me. And I hate to waste people's time, so I think that's very generous of the chairman. And you know, one of the things, Mr. Chairman, has come to my attention that your questions of Mr. Bloom have been answered by the Secretary of the Treasury, and Mr. Bloom forwarded your questions after the hearing.
Actually, no, they haven't. I have the Secretary's answers, and his answer was, "This is a matter of litigation. I cannot answer."
I see. All right. But if the chairman wants to dismiss, I think we should allow these folks to go.
If that's,
I have no problem with that.
Do we have any other questions from anyone else? I'm certainly fine with that. At this point, then we'll take a couple.
One other thing, I did forget to say one thing. When Ms. Maloney was asking the question about anybody saying thank you, I just want you all to know I'm thanking you, and I thank you very much. To Ms. Romero, I'm hoping that this has been helpful to you. I'm hoping that you get the cooperation you need. We, on both sides of the aisle, support your efforts, and we want to make sure you have access to the information that you need in order to do your job. And I want to thank you for working with both of our offices to try to make this thing move along. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ranking Member Cummings.
At this point, we'll take a 1-minute recess while the other members of the panel, but for Mr. Bloom, excuse themselves.
We're looking at this right now. We just got this. This is what Treasury sent him. He just said that the questions were not answered and they invoked the litigation excuse. We're reading it right now to see if that's
Okay.
true.
All right.